One of the surest signs that someone is a serious reader is when you walk into their office and see a 4-shelf, slope-shelved, double-sided metal library cart chock full of books, resting near their desk or in a corner by their bookshelves. Today we're going to tour the book collection of one such library owner. Dr. Nathan Nadeau recently completed a PhD in New Testament studies at McMaster Divinity College and is also the first guest who uses a library cart. Listed on Wikipedia as a book truck, also known as a book trolley or book cart. Dr. Nadeau is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at McMaster Divinity College and an adjunct faculty member at Toronto Baptist Seminary. He is interested in the philosophy of history, Luke Acts, Pauline studies, and the history of biblical criticism, as well as ancient Greek language, thought, religion, and history. He studied German while getting his master's degree and is able to read and translate Koine Greek. But more importantly, you're going to learn how a working biblical scholar puts his library to work in the surface of his scholarly enterprise. Before we jump in, just a quick note that there are some bonus resources that go along with this bookshelf tour in the first link in the description. The first bonus is a downloadable collection of the original high-resolution photos of Dr. Nadeau's library. You'll also get my Classics Resources spreadsheet, which collects in one place all the key details for the major facing page translation book sets like the Loeb Classical Library. You'll also get a new bonus I just recently assembled, a PDF guide with all the tips and tricks I learned about how to keep a library and how to improve my reading from the 55 plus hours of bookshelf tours I've done over the past couple of years. Before we get into the bookshelf tour, I have a couple special requests from Dr. Nadeau. He's looking to acquire 2 rare books for his collection. The first is by Zuntz, Z-U-N-T-Z, Greek, A Course in Classical and Post-Classical Greek Grammar from Original Texts, translated by Stanley Porter, 2 volumes, published in 1994, ideally in hardcover, but paperback is fine also. The second title is by United Bible Society's Biblia, Graeca, Septuaginta, Novum, Testamentum, Graece, Greek edition 2013, and both of those will be in text form down in the video description. Now, let's get into the bookshelf tour with Dr. Nathan Nadeau. Okay, Nathan, so thanks a lot for agreeing to share your library with us, and we've got some photos here of the wide shots of your bookshelves, and you're also the first guest to have a, what do you call this, a book cart or a to-be-read cart?
Yeah, like,
right there.
well, library cart. Like when I bought it looking for a library cart because I call it my office, but it's really about literally 4 feet by 5 feet of an entranceway here. So I've got the library cart, which is actually the half you're looking at, extra stuff basically, and the other half closer to me, like to my right side right now, is stuff I actually use, with a few random things in there, but mostly stuff I'm like grabbing fairly regularly, some of those things. So yeah, library cart. Glad to be the first library cart in one of your tours.
So maybe you could just give us the quick tour of what each bookcase is about and how maybe you acquired some of these major sets.
Yeah, I would say that like in general, most of my stuff has come through my education. Say at least half has come through school and schooling. I was in school for a long time, like graduate school, and did a PhD, so a lot of years of school, and a number of other books, like the big sets there, came through my own interest in reading and my own sort of collecting, trying to get those great sets. And then some other books, some books I have from like just extra there from like even my childhood and some of the other shelves and things like that. So basically it's most of my books. Not I have a few on my desk that I actually didn't get on the shelf, some in like my car and things like that, because you never know when you need a book to read. But I can show you those by hand, at least the ones on some on my desk, or at least I have a couple here maybe. Um, I have purchased many of these and I've been given many of them. Friends, family members over the years, things like that. As far as rhyme or reason goes, clearly the one you're looking at is the most sensible, organized shelf because it's a cabinet and it's containing these two sets, the Harvard Classics and the Great Books of the Western World. But you can tell, like when we go through the images, this is sort of like, it's like you took a home study or library and then you smashed it into like 6 pieces or so, because where I used to live, I had basically a basement to myself. So all the books were on large shelves side by side in a nice corner, looked really nice. When we moved here, which is we love the house much more, but in terms of, it's a really old home. We live in like a 150-year-old home. And so you don't have extra rooms and things like that. So I'm in like it's kind of entrance foyer here. So I've got basically stuff I'm working with here. And then as we go through, I can explain what each shelf kind of,
Okay.
in my mind, what the rhyme and reason is, but I'm actually limited to the space of the shelf pretty much.
So let's start with the Harvard Classics then. How did you pick these up, and what of them have you read, and what do you think about the collection overall?
Yeah, I love the Harvard Classics. They're one of the 2 major collections of, you'd call like great literature, at least as it was conceived. Like this is 20th century. These are like 20th century conceptions, more or less. I bought this complete set, which is in perfect condition. It's kind of I think it's the most famous. Like this is, this was like, I looked at this today. I think it's the 55th printing and the kind of red back 50 volume set there's an extra volume, which is the Book of Lectures. And I have that, maybe it's at the end or on the top there. And then there is, you can see that there, the Book of Lectures on the top. And then there's a little reading guide, which is on the far left. And that's, I think, a fairly standard set. And you can see the reading guide there on the far left, the skinny book on the top left. I bought these off of Kijiji, and it took me a lot of convincing because the guy who was selling them was in Alberta, and he was convinced I was trying to scam him. And it took like a good few emails to be like, I promise you I'm not. I want these books, because he had to ship them, right? And he had to ship them in a pretty large box. And it was a lot of money, and I had to, it was a bit of a process, but they're in great condition. And maybe I can talk a bit about the differences between the sets, but I actually have read more of the Harvard Classics than I have of the great books in terms of these sets. And the reason is because I think the Harvard Classics, I mean, they're smaller volumes. They're sort of better. They're nicer in the hand. And that little reading guide on the left is something you don't really have. Like there is a sort of 10-year reading plan for the great books of the Western world. But that reading guide it's almost half advertisement. It's a really charming little book. And the introduction talks about the set and what it's supposed to mean, and this ideal of liberal education for the common man, and the supposed 15 minutes a day. It's like 15 minutes a day, and you could have the whole deposit of great literature. And actually, that set has a calendar, and every day has a reading, and they have a little paragraph explanation of the reading. Sometimes there's actually a beautiful little like sketch image there. And it's not 15 minutes. Usually it's about maybe 30 minutes if you read as slow as I do, sometimes even more. And you can actually go through, of course, you don't read it all in 365 days, but you get readings from the whole breadth of the set over the course of a year, which I think is really cool, because if you were someone who thought, well, I really don't know much about literature or the tradition of literature and some of the great works, but I'd like to know something, then you could even follow that reading guide and it would give you a basic synopsis of the text. The books have like introductory lectures, introductory essays too, like for the readings, the major readings. But then you could just read and it's going to be like, here's a selection from this author. It's only maybe 5 pages, 10 pages, and depending on the subject matter, could be quick to get through or could take a while. But I actually like that a lot. Part of the goal with getting these sets and getting books in general, but particularly these sets, I just see them as sort of an act of defiance against, endless digitization and everything online and the decline of the technology of the books in terms of people's ability to have them and to use them. So I always think of these 2 sets, even though I'm missing some volumes in the Great Book set, as things that I will keep even if I get rid of many things in my library, because even for posterity's sake, like to my children, it's important to pass them down and say, if you can choose a few things to keep, you keep something like this. I mean, you can basically rebuild, an awareness of great thinking in literature just through a set like this.
So how do you compare that reading guide to this volume here?
If I recall, that volume 50, I have to grab it. I have to go look at it again. This has, I believe, I might have to go look at it. I think it has a number of essays in it and an introduction to the set. It's not like the reading guide. And when I say reading guide, it actually has like a, readings per day. And I haven't picked up that volume 50 in a while. So I'm not exactly sure what's in it. I don't remember what's in it. I would have looked at it extensively when I bought them. But I basically stuck with a little reading guide and I didn't get through the whole year, but I was going quite a ways through it when I got these maybe 5 or 6 years ago.
Do you have any favorites?
In terms of favorites, like I would say my favorites in terms of like Western literature, but this isn't only Western, would probably be the classical literature. I mean, the ancient literature. I study ancient history, ancient Greek. I studied like New Testament studies was my expertise and what I did my PhD in. And so, of course, you have Plato, Epictetus, who was a my goodness, a Stoic philosopher, Marcus Aurelius. So you have some of those. You've got Plutarch's. You can tell that the Harvard Classics set is not organized the way the great books are. So you get Plutarch's Life, Volume 12. I think Volume 1 is like Benjamin Franklin autobiography, things like that. So it's not as like the great books is chronological. And you basically work from antiquity to the modern period. The Harvard Classics shelf is a little bit different than that.
Okay, so we can shift downward now to the great books of the Western world. So what do you think about these?
So there's some great things about the Harvard Classics that I mentioned. I would say that the great book set is more useful academically than the Harvard Classics for 2 reasons. I mean, they're larger volumes. They're sort of, there's a bit of an apparatus in them in terms of some footnotes and things like that. Some of the introductory essays are better, and they are found in the Syntopicon. So you have introductory essays, I believe, in the volumes, but the Syntopicon, which are the 2 volumes on the left-hand side, really this is like the brainchild of Mortimer Adler. So the Harvard Classic set came about from Charles Eliot, who was the principal at Harvard, and he had his own conception of this 5-foot shelf of books, great literature. Mortimer Adler, so that's like Harvard University. Mortimer Adler represents University of Chicago, Encyclopedia Britannica, and different ethos, a sort of different mentality, and the idea. It's a little bit more, you could say, of a philosophical collection. This is supposed to be the great ideas and what he calls this great conversation of ideas. So Mortimer Adler is famous for his book, How to Read a Book, and he's famous for some of his works on classical education, the idea of the great conversation and becoming aware of this sort of classical liberal arts and education. And he has put together the Syntopicon, which is, I mean, like I used this in graduate school when I'm doing when I was working in philosophy of history and the history of like philosophy of history and some of these ideas. You can actually take out the Syntopicon and look for one of these, what he calls great ideas. Maybe it's war or love or history. And then you get some of them are pretty good essays, like even still, on the topic. And then it's actually keyed to the entire set of great books running from antiquity through to the modern period, what these authors have said about, and there's basically an index, like an analytical index on what these authors have said, which is extremely helpful. Adler's whole idea in reading was that, well, you have elementary reading, like just the ability to read in your language, the basic level of reading, but then you go on to higher levels of reading. Shouldn't necessarily say higher, but different kinds of reading. One of them being analytical reading, where you think of like when someone thinks about going to school, they think, I'm going to read everything, like every word, and I'm underlining, things in every paragraph, and I'm really just wrestling with a book. And you do that with very important texts that you're studying. You also want to be able to do what he calls inspectional reading, which is like, okay, someone says, hey, look, did you see this new book that was published in your area? I need to determine whether that's a book worth actually analyzing. So I do this inspectional reading where I look at the table of contents, I kind of skim through the book, I look at the chapters, I look at, the front matter and back matter, what's the contribution, I look at the introductions, conclusions, and I realize, okay, here's a survey, I know all that. But it's really this chapter 5 or chapter 6 that I need to get into. So you do that kind of inspectional reading. You can get through a book like that in a day just by doing this inspectional reading. But then Adler kind of raises as this, like, I shouldn't say last stage, but this kind of crucial kind of reading, which he calls syntopical reading, where you're taking kind of multiple books, and you can do this, he argues, as others have, like there's a canon of Western literature, and they cross-reference each other, the great books. And so you're kind of trying to bring one book into dialogue with another. And I think good scholars do this in their own fields. And part of the task of what you'd call like the history of interpretation in many fields is to kind of do that syntopical reading where you're saying these recent 21st century authors are sort of taking 20th century authors, maybe they're subverting them or they're affirming them, and this is how they're dialoguing with them. This goes back into maybe what ancient authors have said, authors in the Middle Ages have said, and you want to be able to get the kind of broad forest level view of how these ideas are changing over time. And that's kind of what the great books of the Western world is supposed to do. And this set's also newer. So the Harvard Classics went out of print long before the great books did. I believe this is the third edition from the 90s. And so you can tell when you're handling them, they're not as high quality actually as the Harvard Classics in terms of the actual physical production of the book. But you can tell they're newer and they have kind of a newer typeface and things like that.
I think of syntopical reading sort of like preparing for a literature to write a literature review, where you do need to kind of show that you've done the reading and you need to explain to some extent how the field of works kind of fit together and agree or disagree about various things. So I've just always been really impressed, and I forget all the details about how the Syntopicon was created, but I think they had like dozens and dozens of people reading through the entire set, and like every time one of the great ideas was mentioned, they sort of wrote it down. So there's the equivalent of just thousands of man hours that went into creating these two things, and it's sort of a feat of human, sort of like a mega project to go through all this stuff in a way that was never really done before.
Oh yeah. I mean, it's honestly such a service, as you say. It's such a service to any sort of interested reader, because you can't duplicate that work. You can't say, I'm just going to go online and I'm going to get a good encyclopedia article. I'm going to go online. I'm going to kind of search, what did the ancients say about this topic I'm reading in modern literature? You just can't replace the hard work, and we have to do the hard work ourselves in our own studies. But it takes a lifetime, and it takes a real dedication. I mean, Adler's just I was very fond of him as a philosopher and as a writer and a figure in a 20th century education, sort of the renaissance of classical liberal arts education. And it's just such a gift, that Syntopicon. And I found too, like in some of the work that I did, and even some of my own like publications and writing, this set and the Syntopicon gave me kind of a richness and a breadth of, I felt a breadth that you realize even some others don't have. It's nothing special about me, but you simply get the good resources, and you realize there are a lot of people who are content to say, stick to what's been published in the last 15 years. And actually, one of my teachers once told me that he was advised by one of his teachers, who's well known in my field, basically only worry about what's been published in the last 15 years. And he thought, with all due respect to his teacher, that's terrible advice. And I understand in context what he probably meant, but you want the kind of, sometimes you need to do the eagle eye view. And yeah, this is great. The limitations are, if you're looking for more literature, you can see the 59 and 60 there, 20th century imaginative literature. If you're looking for more great literature, sometimes you're thinking, hey, like it's missing some things that the Harvard Classics has, which has, say, non-Western literature or fiction and things like that. Then it's because this was meant to be a more kind of philosophical treatment of great ideas.
You've also got a couple of big heavyweights down here.
Yeah, this I mean, the logic being, I had some space on the shelf, so I had a few books that I thought would fit there. The Book of Virtues is, it's kind of a great family book. We've read this book to our kids on numerous occasions, and it's basically a collection of anecdotes, stories, poetry, excerpts from great books, and it all has a moral aim, so to teach, families, children especially, virtues, disciplines, give them cautionary tales and things like that. It's a great little book, and well, it's not little, it's a great big book. And I've really enjoyed that book, and it's something I recommend to families, especially if, like we're a Christian family, and so we have sort of Christian values that we want to instill in our kids, but also to show them how those values are not just kind of these sort of particular small little things that we've come up with. But the Book of Virtues is nice because you'll get maybe some biblical account, and it's beside a historical account from antiquity or modern history. And you kind of realize there is there's sort of religious tradition, and there's also a cultural tradition, and they kind of intermingle. I always appreciate that when you can kind of give the kids, especially, they don't have this narrow view of maybe the tradition that they're raised in, but it's kind of broadened out, and they realize, oh, this is bigger than maybe sometimes it's treated. The Great Books Reader is, it was edited by John Mark Reynolds, who was I believe he's an Orthodox philosopher, so he's a part of the Christian Orthodox Church, like Eastern Orthodox Church, and he's a philosopher of Plato, but he was involved in classical education, and I used to follow some of his stuff years ago. And the Great Books Reader is good particularly because it has a nice little selection of excerpts from the great books. The essays are hit and miss. Some of them are really not great. Some of them are pretty good by people who are actually experts. Some of them seem more like the publisher and everything probably had, you got to select these kinds of people. And some of them you kind of scratch your head. And a great books reader, you have an opportunity to get real experts who have, long reputations that can say something concise and powerful about a text. And when you don't get those people and you get a random person, you sort of wonder, but the readings are good. And there was you might be familiar with this Gateway to the Great Books, which
Yeah.
is like a 10-volume set. And I always wanted to get that, but I thought, if someone's like that, I don't know about the great books. Well, the great books reader is something to give them to say, hey, dip your toes, and why don't you see what you can read and what kind of lights your fancy, and then go from there. And then there's just a book of American verse, which is pretty good, but I'm like a dilettante in terms of poetry, and so sometimes I look for big names. Like there's a poem I really love by Ezra Pound, but it's not in there, and so I'm thinking, why isn't this poem I love in there? He's an American poet. It's a great poem of his. Oh, well. But that's a book I think I inherited from my parents or something that I just took with me years ago when I moved away.
So for people listening, this is the Oxford Book of American Verse. And I have another bookshelf tour coming out in 2 or 3 weeks of a guy who has a bunch of these. And they're sort of, I think of them as almost like Oxford really specializes in these, kind of like how they specialize in dictionaries. And if you put them all together, they are sort of like the equivalent of the great books of the Western world, but collections of verse and some other stuff as well. So that one caught my eye as well. But we can zoom out here and move to the next bookcase here. So what are we looking at here?
Yeah, the only other thing I'll say, one thing real quick on the great books, is that I did have that. There's that other book there called The Great Conversation, and that's a delightful little book. And I was happy to get that copy, like mint condition. It's a great coffee table book, if for people who know the set, and it has great essays in it by Mortimer Adler, by others who collaborated with him. It actually has kind of nice, you don't want to call them infographics, but they're nice graphics, timelines, and descriptions of the authors. And I think it's in the back of the Great Conversation that you do get a 10-year reading plan for the great book. So if someone's interested in the great books of the Western world, but they can't get them, the Great Conversation is actually nice to have. It'll give you kind of a sense of what it's all about.
Yeah. And I believe there's a few videos on YouTube of people kind of flipping through this. I have a copy of this as well, and I'm going to be doing a review of it.
Cool.
There's a lot of interesting sort of in business history or advertising history. I think this was given away as a free gift or as some kind of promotional thing. And just the promotional material for these books is extremely interesting. And it's probably some of the like highest quality advertising ever done. Because it is so like informative in and of itself. They just sort of took the coolest. They took sort of the YouTube shorts of the classics and like put them into a big kind of ad booklet, and so it's very visual and just a fun. It's sort of in some ways funner to read or look at than just the plain text that you get in the book. So I definitely recommend those kind of things.
For sure. Okay, this is this is kind of, I should say it's kind of random. It's not random, but it's sort of random shelf one, again, because my library had to be broken up, and for pragmatic reasons I needed things I used beside me. This shelf overall is sort of philosophy, hermeneutics, some New Testament stuff, theology, literature, history, and there's a bit of a mixed bag. The stuff on top of the shelf is either large books we used as a family, or just random books there. And so, yeah, there's nothing really exceptional in terms of what's up there. But you've just got some stuff that either won't fit or I got at a later time and didn't really have space for on the shelf.
What's
I guess
this annotated
those
Sherlock
around.
Holmes like?
It's really cool, actually. I have listened to, but not read, basically all Sherlock Holmes. So, Stephen Fry has he's got an excellent like audio anthology of Sherlock Holmes. But this is really cool. And like, I like Sherlock Holmes. So I like, of course, the stories, but even in some of the work I did in philosophy of history, Arthur Conan Doyle's kind of what he did in the narratives and kind of treating Holmes as this sort of, he called it deduction. I think that's kind of what he says, but it's not doing deduction. He's doing what you call induction or abduction. But Holmes kind of like, if you are interested in informal kind of like logic and reasoning, those stories they actually have some really compelling examples of what you call detective work, guesswork, and in a technical sense, guesswork or abductive logic and reasoning. And there are historical examples of people who were known to the author that have some pretty amazing feats in this regard. And there's a philosopher. What is the guy's? There was a medical doctor. Maybe I could send it to you after, who was known to the author, and he used to teach, and he used to do this basically his case study in medical cases where someone is brought to him, and it's a mystery of what the illness is, and he would kind of run through this sort of. So I'm going to get a phone call here in a second. He would kind of run through this process of doing what you call like a kind of Holmesian guess of what the person has, and able to so I think there were some feats where it was known, others knew what he had, this person did not know but was able to guess. And for things like the appearance of the person, where they were from, his world knowledge of maladies in certain parts of the world and things like that, and really interesting stuff. There's also an example of Charles Peirce, who was a famous 20th century philosopher and logician who, there's a great little book by Umberto Eco and a couple others called The Sign of Three. And it's Peirce, Holmes, and someone else. And in that book, you have some examples of Peirce too, who's doing this, what he would call it guessing, but guessing in a way that is kind of informed by this deep familiarity with the logic of explanation. And it would almost seem to be magic, I think, to people who aren't familiar with how, for example, mentalists and people like that use this kind of reasoning. But that's just kind of a side thing. I like Holmes. Those, for people who really like Holmes, they have all the footnotes, historical information, details, and everything in there.
So, by the way, how did you get into history of philosophy when philosophy of history, when your specialty is ancient Near East or New Testament?
Yeah, the specialty, New Testament and really the Roman world. Not so much the ancient Near East, but the philosophy of history, not the history of philosophy. And you made the thing, because sometimes they may seem, oh, it's the same kind of thing, but very different. And the philosophy of history, you could and I'll try to be really concise because I'm liable to speak for a long time on the topic, but the label would have kind of two senses, and maybe traditionally a philosophy of history would seem to be something like what the German philosopher Hegel was doing. And you think of someone like Marx, who had a kind of philosophy of history, and sometimes this is kind of pejoratively called a speculative philosophy of history, and that refers to a belief about the nature of history and its structure. Sometimes you hear language, the deep structure of history, because of the time that this came out of. You can trace philosophies of history back into antiquity in terms of beliefs about the nature of history, what is universal in history, and things like that. But the way that I use it, and the way that contemporary philosophers of history tend to mean it, is that this field is devoted to reasoning about history, kind of in the way I was mentioning. We have in our present world, historical evidence. And the issue for the last generation or two for a number of philosophers have been, how do you deal with the problems of language, the problems of evidence, and the problem of facts, for example, and arriving at a knowledge of the past. When you work in ancient history and even in biblical studies, these questions are kind of central. The idea of coming up with, plausible explanations for things that you believe happened, and you can kind of nuance that in very sophisticated technical ways. But basically, you want to say, "Hey, I have texts. There are artifacts. There are all sorts of debates and competing opinions. How would you know that one view could be better than another? How do you work with different kinds of evidence? How do you reason about them and fit them into kind of the context of antiquity? Like, these come in narratives sometimes, even in stories, and then in our own reasoning today." So I kind of got into it through the back door, and I read a number of works, did some publications in the area when I was in the early part of my PhD.
Okay. So anything you want to point out on this shelf here?
I would say that the kind of big book by Anthony Kenny, A New History of Western Philosophy, is probably, I haven't read through the whole thing. I've read through a decent chunk of it and then looked at much of it. This is originally 4 volumes. It's kind of collected in one. I think it's probably the best one volume. History of philosophy, so not philosophy of history. That's different. It's really good. I am sort of also dilettante in logic. I like logic. I'm not good at the formal logic. You think of like the formal logical notation, but a couple books there, that Good Reasoning Matters by Groark and Tyndale, which is a Canadian text, and that book Socratic Logic by Peter Kreeft, they're really good. And if someone's interested in, you think, oh, I like a I like a textbook on logic, you could pick up the textbook there by Patrick Hurley, but you're going to quickly get into stuff that's probably over most people's pay grade, and you're like, I'm really going to invest all that time. What we really want is a good handle on basic good reasoning. What are arguments like? What is deduction? What is induction? How do you structure arguments? What are fallacies? And get rid of, get the numbers and equations and funny notation away from me. I just want a kind of qualitative, robust expose of logic. Those 2 books are really good. And I definitely recommend them to people who are like, yeah, I'd like to be a good reasoner, but I don't want to become I don't want to be doing equations for why I believe what I believe. I want to have a good kind of shoot from the hip ability to, smell when something's not right and give an accounting for why I believe certain things. So they're really good books. On the same token, you've got some of those books by Ward Farnsworth, and I have this book, Classical English Argument, there. The Socratic Method is a bit more of a technical book of his, and it's really interesting. But that book, Classical English Argument, is also kind of nice in the vein of what I was just saying, where he treats, like, in a really pragmatic way, how basically arguments took place in English parliaments and from English writers in history. And yes, like, not only logical fallacies and argumentative fallacies, but also rhetorical tools. And it's just fun to read. Like, he basically will mention a category and then he'll give examples of, like, this was said on the floor of, Parliament somewhere. And it's like, you realize, man, those guys were like, they were doing some high level, like, rhetoric and argumentation. And it's really, really fascinating. Yeah, I mean, some more of the same there. Philosophy of history, a couple books on philosophy of history, and then at the end of the shelf, there are some books on, you'd call hermeneutics, which is, if you're outside the field, maybe a bit of a strange term. It comes from a German writer called Friedrich Schleiermacher, but basically, if you're in biblical studies, literary criticism, you'll see this term come up. Some philosophers too. Hermeneutics, this idea of interpretation and understanding of texts. And so those are some textbooks I had from school, basically. And I think most of those are school books that I had. Yeah.
Do you know what term was used before hermeneutics existed?
You would get various terms. I mean, I'm not like a literary major, and so there are various German terms like understanding and things like that. You do get words like, simply reading and interpretation, even back to antiquity, like Aristotle has works on interpretation, and so these ideas always go back. But the Germans tended to, invent technical terms that had all sorts of meanings that are sometimes hard for us non-Germans to really wrap our minds around, because they had that sort of what we call now like sort of kind of continental way about their reasoning, and somewhat more poetic, and even a sense of like richness to these ideas of, when you say understanding, we might think understanding means, do I know something? But when they say understanding and interpretation, they're talking about something maybe much more complex and technical. But I probably can't give you, by an academic's honor, it's a bit out of my lane. Yeah, a bit more of the same there at the beginning. But that shelf you're on now is basically what I call my Paul shelf. So most of the books on this shelf have to do with St. Paul or the Apostle Paul. And some of these are works of theology, some of them are works of history, some of them are sort of handbooks on Paul. And I would say that books on Paul are like ubiquitous, and there are many books on Paul. Technically, I've written a book on Paul. It's forthcoming. It's not out yet, and it's not exactly on Paul, but it's on Paul and another book in the New Testament. But
You want to say the
there are. The title will be The Puzzle of Paul in Acts, and that's Paul in the Book of Acts. It's coming out with Routledge Books, which is an academic publisher, but these things take time, and it's gonna be some months yet before that sees the light of day. There are many books on Paul, maybe a few that you're kind of coming over just now I can point out, because I think that if people are interested in New Testament and what are these New Testament writers saying, you want to get some great books. And I would say that there's a book there by F.F. Bruce called Paul, Apostle of the Heart Set Free, or Apostle of the Free Spirit. I would say that's a classic book. It's an excellent book there that someone could pick up historically. There was a great book that you passed just a little bit ago called Paul, an Outline of His Theology by Hermann Ritterboss, which these are classic books. And yeah, I would say if you're looking for a couple, you could pick up the book by Ritterboss or the book by F.F. Bruce there, and they would give you even the book on the top there by William Ramsey. Yeah, they're dated, so some of they bear the marks of their time, but there's a difference between becoming a cutting-edge scholar and having a classic understanding of a field. And cutting-edge books come, and then they go away. Probably like my book will, because they're not always liable to be great books. But the great books, 50 years later, you say, hey, like these books kind of stood the test of time, and in their own time, they had a real impact. I still think those are the best books to start reading. Then you can update your knowledge with new books and kind of refine things and let go of some dogmas you may have picked up. But start with the classic books. And yeah, those are a few that I would mention there.
Okay, so now we're into the next set of shelves here.
Okay, so yeah, you can see a difference now. This is getting into some mythology, literature, and history. I'm also interested in mythology, comparative mythology. Again, like a dilettante's interest. So I've got some books there. Fraser's James Fraser is like the classic anthropologist, one of these early anthropologists. The Golden Bow or the Golden Bough is a classic work. This is the abridgment of his 12-volume, I think, major book. And the interesting thing about Fraser is really interesting to read. Great writer, and a major work in his own time. Probably still deserves to be taken seriously in some ways, but Fraser did all his work at his desk, and people like me who do most of their work at their desk kind of like that, because you think, hey, you can do great work at your desk. But anthropologists tend to work in the field. I mean, when you work with texts like me, you can, and you work with published texts. Like I've done some work in manuscripts, but I don't really need to go, and you can get images of them now online. But when you work in a field like that, you want to be in the field. And Fraser's interesting because he's kind of notoriously would get reports of missionaries and then kind of disregard the missionaries, but he just wrote at his desk and wrote and wrote and wrote. And an interesting figure. He went blind. And the old kind of line is that he went blind writing his book, and because he just was obsessed with this work he was doing. And he wrote at a time when that discipline was still forming, and sometimes people were freer with the freedom with which they expressed their ideas without really fear of pushback. And so he's got some interesting ideas. But Joseph Campbell, pretty well known, similarly panned by some people. I tend to like reading Joseph Campbell if you understand maybe some issues in his work and some infelicities and things like that. You take it for what it is. I think he's a compelling writer, and he had a real love for the literature he wrote about. And I tend to like Joseph Campbell a lot, actually, for those reasons. A better book would be this book by Jan Povel, Comparative Mythology. That's like a college text. And if you want something in the vein of a Campbell or a Fraser that's kind of more critical, more recent, but still good to read and meant for college level reader, that's a great book, actually.
What about Morphology of the Folktale?
Yeah, Morphology of the Folktale is a book by Vladimir Propp, and this is more of a German kind of book on the form and the linguistic and literary form of folk literature. And you might think of people like the Grimm brothers, also German linguists who worked in German folk literature. And so I think Vladimir Propp's a German scholar. I've not read the book. I had it, and I read, I think, the first couple chapters when I got it. And of course, as in many cases, we buy these books to look at later, to remind us of what we don't know, also to read, and then you start reading and set them aside. But it's an important little book, I understand, and kind of more technical in terms of the literary and linguistic form and function of folk literature. Eric Auerbach's big book, Mimesis, is a book on it's kind of a classic book. I've not read through the whole thing, but some of its sections I think are profound. And this is a book on what he calls the representation of reality in Western literature. That's translated from the German. It's an interesting book. What's interesting about that book is that he wrote it, I believe, at a time, and maybe it's kind of interwar or within a war, where he didn't have access to libraries and a bunch of secondary literature. So basically, he's working from these texts and his own knowledge, and just a brilliant and deep thinker. And so he's reflecting on the meaning of these texts and how they're representing the human experience and reality. And some of it is, I think it's profound. He has some profound things to say about the New Testament, interesting things to say about Homeric literature, like the sections I've read. And it's one of those books I understand to be a great book, something it's if you're interested in Western literature, you'd want to pick up and look at, and kind of compelling for the non-specialist, because you have a kind of real vibrant writer who's writing from his own understanding and his own mind, and he's not like necessarily sifting through endless secondary literature to see what they're all saying. He's just doing what we all wish and want to do, which is he's just writing, and from his own hermeneutical understanding, right? His own position of understanding. And that's where you get, kind of really compelling stuff. Okay, let me pick up the pace here. I could keep going. Two books there by Mikhail Rostovtzeff, Greece and Rome. They're great books to have, really easy to read. They're basically the first two volumes of his history of the Greek and Roman Empire. and which is not the same as his social and economic history of the Greek and Roman Empire, which are classic textbooks. I had to go through a couple of them for one of my comprehensive exams. But Greece and Rome are good little books if you want an easy to read overview of these eras of history and these cultures. The interesting thing about them, which depending on who you are, you will or won't like this, is that he doesn't include primary texts. And you might think, how can a great historian not include primary text? But he's so great a historian that he says, you should just be reading all these primary texts on your own anyway, so I'm not going to include them in here for you to read. But he's got a really good overview, and he was a Russian. I think he came to the United States. So he went, I'm not in the United States, he went to the United States. What's interesting about him, someone once called him the last of the 19th century ancient historians, referring to a person with kind of so broad a grasp of antiquity. And you get legends of these kinds of people, like Theodore Mommsen, who are like, their knowledge is kind of, it seems like it comes from a time like another world. And he had this kind of ability to have this just broad understanding of antiquity, and then this broad treatment of antiquity. And probably in more contemporary criticism, that tends to go away. And you get more people with more specialized understandings, more critical understandings, for better or for worse. Some ancient texts there, Plato's Republic. I have those three, kind of the three great ancient historians, classical historians. Not in proper order there. You'd have Herodotus, Thucydides, and Xenophon, but these are the landmark editions. And I've worked with Herodotus, Thucydides, and to an extent Xenophon in my own work. Those are always good to have. If you're working with Greek texts, but you want to come to the English text and say, hey, what's the context for this? I really like the landmark editions. They've got great introductions, footnotes, maps. They have little marginal notes and really help to situate. They're kind of massive works, right? They help to situate these works in their context. I'm not a classicist, and so I kind of come to the field again from the side, not from the back door, from the side door. New Testament, Roman world. I'm familiar. I study classical Greek, Hellenistic Greek. I'm familiar with the world, but through the kind of literature and thought world of the New Testament and early Christianity. So, kind of handbooks or textbooks like that with the text are just invaluable, I think.
So when you're using this language of side door, back door versus front door, are you meaning front doors like academic, side doors, it's a side interest, and back doors, it's a just reading popular or just a hobby level?
Not really. I'm sort of meaning it in a way that, front door would be, this is my specialty. Like I studied this. Back door would be, and maybe I mentioned that with, I forget when I said that. But more like disconnected to the major field. And maybe I shouldn't have used back. Maybe I'm mixing my I'm not being so technical with the metaphor. But side door being like, hey, this isn't my main area, but I kind of came to it from another room, which is adjacent to it. I'm in the New Testament. Yes, that's first century Roman world. Maybe the High Roman era coming into early Christianity. Yeah, Greek. You get Latin. Okay. But classics proper isn't my area. It's in the room over. So you kind of go into the room, you say, can I get the lay of the land, do justice to it, but I haven't kind of taken up residence in there. And so I, wouldn't present myself as like a classicist or an ancient historian per se.
Okay.
Yeah, the Greek myths there, those are the Robert Graves volumes with the Folio Society. Robert Graves is also an interesting person. And his volumes of the Greek myths are interesting because they're not always easy to trace out where he's taken everything from. There are better sources, and he was a bit of he had his own ideas about the meanings of the great myths and the meanings of sort of mythic religion and things like that. And he actually had his own kind of idiosyncratic beliefs. But his Greek myths are easy to read, and I think they're kind of classic. So I really like those Folio Society editions. Just beautiful volumes. I wouldn't point out anything. I mean, I like all these books. I could talk about each one of them. Ancient Mysteries is a source book, so that actually has ancient texts in it in terms of like you'd call them like mystery cults, mystery religions. Against Fire's a novel. Some technical books there. A few books on paganism, which again is just a side interest of mine. Ronald Hutton is sort of a world expert, and I like his books. That Triumph of the Moon's basically on witchcraft as a kind of modern phenomenon, as he would consider a modern religion. Pagan Britain's a more historical text. But those books that are beside them with the kind of dolphins, not the one that says pagans, it's okay, but the Thames and Hudson's books there, and particularly the black one, which is the complete world of Greek mythology. It's a really good book. Thames and Hudson, it's sort of mixed bag. They put together really nice books, very well illustrated, a lot of beautiful like photos of artifacts and art, but some of them are actually great books in terms of their academic quality. I'm not saying that the other authors aren't academically, legitimate. I think they are. But that book by Richard Buxton, The Complete World of Greek Mythology, is actually really good. It's good as a textbook if you want to say, hey, I want an actual good critical understanding. That book's a really good production by a real scholar in Greek mythology, and the fact that it's so full of pictures and everything just makes it that much better. It's a great book. Highly recommended. Some more mixed stuff here. You can see some gospel stuff, some interpretation stuff, just doesn't fit on another shelf, and I maybe didn't. Well, I'm not going to make any qualitative judgment about it. Some of those are great books, but some of the hermeneutics books, I just didn't want to put it on the top for various reasons. And some of these were textbooks from school that I had left over. So yeah, all good books. Usually I try to keep the books that I thought were good, or at least good to give away to somebody. Some more New Testament books. Some of them are kind of random. And Quest of the Hero, True Mythos could belong with the Joseph Campbell above, just no room. And again, when you're limited with shelf space, unfortunately, you have to put books that belong with others on different shelves. There's a book of poetry by William Butler Yeats, who's an Irish poet. Is he a romantic? You may know better than me, but I do love some of his poetry. The Black Spine there is It a Secret? It's a book on werewolves, which kind of along some interest in paganism I had. That's a very interesting book by an author called Sabine Baring-Gould, who, for anyone who's a Christian and who knows hymnody, will be familiar with the hymn Onward Christian Soldiers, which was written by Sabine Baring-Gould. It's an old hymn. You don't really ever hear it sung. But I like that book because here was someone who was, again, he's from a different time. And he wrote this book of werewolves that he called An Account of a Terrible Superstition, where he was one of those sort of polymaths and was competent in many ancient languages. And he gathered anecdotes from his own research and world travels on what he thought was a terrible superstition. And not just saying it's a fantasy of the mind, but something horrendous and terrible, which has seen across cultures. And how to actually take them is another question, but he has accounts, from Norse cultures, from ancient Greek culture, Roman culture, English countryside, things like that, of what we'd call therianthropy or lycanthropy, human, at least the perception of transformation into animals. And it's curious, it's strange. And if you want some kind of unnerving stories, you can pick up a book like that, because some of them are quite disturbing, actually. I love C.S. Lewis, and I have a few of his books here. On another shelf, I have some others from Lewis. The Quotable Lewis is a great, maybe I'll just mention one there because a lot of people know a lot of Lewis, but the Quotable Lewis is a great volume to have if you like C.S. Lewis and you like his prose writing and the things he has to say on, ideas and topics. It's a really great volume. I really like that volume a lot. I've used it many times. And in addition to teaching and work as in research and writing, I also do pastoral work in a church in terms of preaching and teaching in a church context. And a quotable Lewis, C.S. Lewis is always quotable. And so people probably groan and roll their eyes when I quote him by now, but he's got something great to say on almost everything. So
How is it organized?
just thematically. So I think it's alphabetical, and it goes alphabetically through themes, like politics, things like that, poetry, whatnot. It'd be poetry than politics, but you know what I mean. Yep, some more by Lewis, Space Trilogy. Chesterton, who was kind of, he came before Lewis, was an influence on Lewis. Then I have some random literature there. There's one copy of the Iliad. Sure, I had another copy here at my desk, which I didn't have on my shelf before. Interestingly, aside from the great books, which has a sort of more poetic translation, that copy of the Odyssey and this copy by Martin Hammond are prose translations. That's more of an everyman's literature. This volume I have in my hands, which is published by Duckworth, which is a great sort of publisher of works in classics. This is really good. It's prose, so it's not kind of given any sort of poetic form. It's not according to lines in the, which you have the kind of lines in the critical editions of the poetry. But I would say the volume by Hammond. So I've looked at many. I've read the Iliad in a couple or all of it in one translation, and a lot of it in another. I've read parts of the Odyssey in multiple translations. I'm not great in Homeric Greek, but I've read the Homeric Greek of various sections, and studies and looking it up. This copy I have in my hand by Martin Hammond is really good, because I would say he gives the sense of the Homeric Greek. And he's got this great little argument to say that we can't really, like what we're doing with poetry translations is sort of an artifice where we're rendering it in sort of English poetry in some way, but we can't actually do what you'd call the dactylic hexameter. And of course, in Greek poets and like playwrights, there were other kinds of poetic meter, but in Homer, it's the dactylic hexameter, like the da 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 da. You can't really do that, pull it off in English in a way that is kind of true to form, but you can get at the sense of the Homeric Greek with prose and the way that you render it. And he's done a great job. And I think someone doesn't read Greek, but they want to be confronted with Homer's style. You can actually do it with a prose translation, and Hammond is really good. I think the great poetry translations, like by Pope and Lattimore, some others like Fitzgerald, you're confronted with English poetry, which is beautiful in its own right, but it's a different kind of confrontation. So that's all I have to say about that. Yes, some more. Well, I'd say it's random. Some literature there. There's a book on kind of like paganism and mysticism and the Third Reich and Hitler's. I haven't read the book. I've read a few chapters of it. It's really interesting, by Eric Kurlander. And some other literature. Umberto Eco's pretty well known. There's a little low classical library reader, which probably should be on the shelf beside me, and that's Greek and Latin. So if you read some Greek and Latin and you want to a little précis of the low classical library, that's kind of a nice little book. They used to have, you're probably familiar, they used to have a volume, sorry. I don't know if it was hardcover, but it had that image on the front. It had a kind of nice, I forget what the image is called, but the image on the front looked a lot nicer. Was it Tower of Babel? I thought maybe it was one version of that painting. And I thought it was a much nicer looking volume than this volume, which is just a picture of the books, the spines of the books. So, but if you have a
people
low-class
watch my tour of Harvard University Press. That's one of the I had the editorial director, Sharmila signed that item, and that was one of the books we gave away. So,
Oh, wow. I saw a decent chunk of that video.
yeah, it's near the end. It's like the last hour. We did all the signings of the giveaway books. So, she gave a little story about how it came to be. And originally it wasn't for sale. It was like a gift to booksellers. And then it was so popular, they turned it into like an actual book. And started.
Was it hardcover? Was the older one hardcover?
Hardcover.
Okay.
But I could be wrong about that.
Yeah, because I like that other one. Yeah, that's pretty much those shelves. I think, is there one more shelf down there at the bottom, which we can probably... Oh, that's right. There's two. See, look, I'm so far away from it, I forget. Probably really quickly here, probably more interesting things to say about the books around me. Some of this is more literature. I love Tolkien. So you've got the anniversary edition of The Lord of the Rings. There's some other literature there. That book by Rodney Stark is an excellent book called The Triumph of Christianity, which is sort of an updated edition of his book, The Rise of Christianity. Tom Holland's Dominion is, I would say Stark's book is better, but Holland's Dominion book is more of the moment, and people are quite familiar with that book now. Some other kind of literature, contemporary literature on culture, human nature by David Berlinski. I read that book. It's an excellent little book by an interesting thinker on just essays, language, on culture, on science, on history. Really good. The book by Carl Trueman is kind of a commentary on contemporary culture and, like identity politics and things like that. And he's a good historian, so probably cuts through some of the sensationalism that you get out there. So Carl Trueman, if people are interested in the discussion, even though it's always changing now, Trueman would be a really good person to read.
And he has some lectures books on YouTube.
Yeah, he does actually, I think, on the topic. So yeah, you can even watch him and listen to him. Some books on the intellectual life. I've read these 3 books, not in Habits of the Mind, yes, Intellectual Life, most of it, Lost in Thought, a good portion of it. And when I did a course in pedagogy, I used them in a major paper I wrote on sort of the intellectual life and reading and studying, and they're very helpful.
Could you say a little bit more about this one? Because it seems to have been having a second life recently.
Really? I didn't know it had second life. So Sertalanges was, I think, a Catholic intellectual. And this is sort of a more like meditative book, I would say. The others are, Lost in Thought is kind of meditative as well. But he speaks about the nature of the intellectual life and the calling of the intellectual life. And I found it very compelling when people think about, why am I reading? Why am I studying? What does it mean to be the kind of person who wants to read and to understand? And is that a calling? Like, is that a vocation? And he speaks about the notion of an avocation, like a calling away, where perhaps, for many, many people, as you say, maybe you meet someone and they work a day job, but, they kind of moonlight as someone who loves books or languages or things like that. Well, that's kind of what he calls an avocation, if I'm remembering the sources right, like a calling away. And hobby doesn't do the term justice, but you have that kind of language there. So I thought that, at least when I looked from what I read when I read it a number of years ago now, I thought it was a great little book. Yep. Those are just, the rest of the shelf is basically Christian theology. There's those 2 books on Christian history, but the rest of it is Christian theology. Anything stand out here?
These all kind of seem like they're part of a series.
They are, yeah. That's a series called Contours in Christian Theology. They're better and worse. The book by Paul Helm on the Providence of God is really good. It's probably the best book in that series. I haven't read all of them. I think I've read 3 or 4 of them, and I've looked at most of them. Paul Helm was a great philosopher. He died, I think, last year. Probably why I want to mention it, because he recently died. And he was what you'd call a Calvinist, and sort of unpopular kind of theology for many people, especially philosophers, where their analytic philosophers tend not to be of that tradition. Paul Helm was a good example of kind of a broad-minded, reformed in his theology, so it's a technical term, but doing good philosophy. And so if you want, someone who's kind of not caught up in, there were sort of American kind of Christian culture wars around these theologies in the last generation. If you want a better thinker from outside that kind of fray who's doing good philosophy, Paul Helm, I really liked, and I liked that volume actually.
Who would be some names for those Americans you're referring to?
I think names of people who are like, I'm thinking of when I was growing up. I mean, I've come into a tradition which you'd call as particular Baptist. And so this has a tradition in English history as being sort of Calvinistic Baptist. And it's historical. It doesn't come up from what I would say is kind of the last generation's, what they called like the Young Restless and Reformed movement. And that definitely had some sort of impact. I didn't read any of those books, and sort of happy that I didn't, because it was kind of a moment and it was a little bit superficial. Any names? I would say that probably these were like not necessarily scholars, mostly pastors in American Christianity. Don't really care to name many of them, but not really worth the time. So better to read some people like Paul Helm. Yeah, and those are just some random books there.
What about this Drama of Doctrine?
The Drama of Doctrine is kind of a book on hermeneutics by a great American theologian called Kevin Van Hooser. And he's doing this sort of, he had another major book before this called like, Is There a Meaning in This Text? So this was his, I haven't read this book in full, but the other one I did. This is kind of like, how do you get this challenge of saying Christians have dogma or doctrine or theology, which are systems of beliefs about God and the world and humanity, the church. You have basically 7 classic areas. And then you have texts, holy texts. And then you have history. And how do you kind of take text and dogma as it's sort of developed through history and kind of have them coherent? Because you kind of do get a bifurcation in Christian intellectual life of biblical scholars. So people like myself who are like, I want the language and the history and to do the technical work with ancient texts and put them in their historical contexts and not to overinterpret. And then you have theologians who are saying, I want kind of the system, the systematization, the more analytic or philosophical approach of like answering the big questions. Who is God? What is man? What is the nature of the world? And Van Hooser is one of a number of theologians who are kind of doing biblical and systematic theology together. So that book, I believe, he's trying to take the problem of language and the question of the text and kind of bring it together with theology and dogma. So he operates from this viewpoint, which would be called canonical, taking the text, without kind of people's eyes, glossing over, taking the text in its final form as a canon. The canon referring to, we talked before about the canon of Western literature. We have a canon of Holy Scripture, and this canon having some kind of univocality according to the Christian tradition. And so, maybe Van Hooser would advocate you're not really kind of penetrating into this kind of critical biblical studies approach and taking the canon apart. You're keeping it as a whole and trying to do this sort of what he would call, I suppose, a canonical reading that is paying attention to the nature of language. And he would advocate things like speech act theory and the nature of utterances and things like that. So it's a bit of a technical work, actually.
Okay. Anything else up here?
The book called The Unseen Realm at the end there by Michael Heiser was an interesting book. It kind of took maybe the Christian world by storm a few years ago, sold a lot of copies. He was an Old Testament scholar that kind of was doing this popular level work of his own ideas. And I thought it was a great little book. That publisher, either Lexham Press or they've worked with another. The reason I mention it is he died recently, maybe a few years ago. And they published an edition of that book with a lot of extra material that he'd written. So if people are interested in, like, he's kind of doing this, you know, kind of put it in his words, like, what is the strange and spooky nature of the biblical world that get behind the sanitization that many, he's thinking of a church context. Many Christians like a very clean and neat, and Christianity maybe where the Bible seems like it's very comfortable to you and it's kind of fits nicely on your shelf with all your other books, and it's a nice, it's in English too, and it's probably basically like everything that you think about the world is just reflected there. He was kind of in a very gentle way saying, the Bible is sort of stranger than you think. And it doesn't mean that you need to change your whole worldview, but you need to be confronted with the strangeness of this world. And, maybe some people in the academic world are always critics, right? But I thought it was a great little book. And do I agree with all of it theologically? No, but I thought he was a real earnest writer, good faith writer with some real expertise, even if he had some kind of idiosyncratic views. And it was a great book. If that sounds interesting to someone, I'd say pick it up, or pick up the new version with some extra material.
I don't know if you saw the part of Jason Johnston's tour where we talked about the Dark Bible, Cultures of Interpretation in Early Modern England by Alison Knight.
I didn't. I saw, because that was a long video too, right? But you'll have to point that out to me. That's a new book?
Yeah, it's 2022, and it's this book kind of reminded me of that one. The Dark Bible explores early modern England's interaction with difficult aspects of the Bible. For the early modern reader, although the Bible was understood to be perfect, sufficient, and transcendent, it was not always experienced as such.
Interesting. There's probably some differences there, but that does sound like an interesting book for sure. Bottom shelf, we can probably blast through. I would always point out Redwall. Those are just great books. They're the kind of those little mass market paperbacks on the side there at the bottom. They're kind of just that way. Those are great books from my childhood. I have others lying around the house for our own kids, but I thought, I've been reading them recently with my kids. Just great literature. It's got nothing to do with most other stuff on my shelves, but really great children's literature with real kind of it's sort of the anthropomorphized animals kind of literature, if you like that, but great morals. The author was educated, broadly educated, very world experienced man from kind of another time. And if you like children's literature that's captivating for adults, has some serious themes in it, doesn't shy away from death and war, and has some great morals and great virtues, they're just excellent books. And I did not read them all. I had like 20 of them, but some of them are really great books. And the rest of this is some random stuff on the shelf. Those books by Alistair McGrath, I enjoyed reading them. Basically, generalist books on like Christian worldview for sort of, seekers and people with questions, curiosities. So they're really good. The Apples of Apollo is a bit of a strange book. Same with The Immortality Key. I wrote a review on that with Academia Letters. That happens to be by far and away my most read academic review, and which is kind of, I'm a bit ashamed of it because it's not a book I think is good at all. And but it's airport reading, with all due respect to the author. He's a sharp guy who did a lot of work into it. But when I say airport reading, I mean it's the kind of book you pick up at the airport because you say, wow, that sounds sensational. And you follow the thread and you realize it is sensational. It's basically a sensationalist kind of book. A lot of historical problems in it. But the author did some real work, so credit to him. And well, I don't want to be too kind, but Yeah, well, I wrote the review, so if you look my name up, or maybe you can paste my blog and my academia link in the description, you could read what I think about it. Some other books.
Do you suggest in the review an alternative to this, or do you have one?
I'd have to look at it again. I probably have something in the footnotes, like some better reading.
Yeah.
The problem is it's not really a like, yes, there are definitely better works on, I mentioned before, like Rodney Stark's, like The Triumph of Christianity or The Rise of Christianity. Some of those books on earliest Christianity, second century Christianity. Yeah, I mention some of the review? I might. I could probably, if I spend some time, think about some. There are good books by, even if someone's like, hey, I don't really want the position that I mean, Rodney Stark's book, he may be a Christian, but when he wrote it, he wasn't. So it's not like he's got the official position of the church. Even if someone's like, I'm interested in early Christianity, but I don't want the kind of maybe a received Christian position, even if it's by a scholar, even Bart Ehrman's books on kind of lost gospels and things like that are much better than anything, which are good books. Ehrman's got good books, even if I disagree with him on some things, but much, much better than a book like The Immortality Key, for sure. Yeah, and some other random books there.
Okay. All right, so that wraps up that bookcase, and now we're on to the
library cart.
Yeah, the library cart.
Actually, it came to me one day because I have no space. I can have a portable shelf, and I can actually push my chair in and move that behind my desk and open up the back door here. And it's great. It's honestly been such a great addition to the study here. I won't say much about this side. It's kind of the back shelf. It's, some good things there. Kylan Delitzsch's classic commentary on the Old Testament. It's much older. I've used it a little bit. I don't use it much. It was gifted to me by my uncle. But that's sort of a major set. And there's an Old Testament introduction there by Kyle. I have 2 volumes of the shorter Oxford commentary, which are both volume 2. And I have this problem. I was trying to get both volumes of the set, and I was sent 2 times only volume 2, even though the seller said 2 volumes. As I was refunded, and I'm like, I want to make sure I'm getting volumes 1 and 2 or volume 1, because I have volume 2. Yeah, okay, it's 2 volumes. And then I just got volume 2 again. And so now I have 2 volumes. But I like the new shorter Oxford English Dictionary because I like physical books, and you're not going to get I don't have space for the big Oxford English Dictionary. You're probably familiar with the one that they put in, like, that massive volume where they put like multiple page images on each page, and it came with a magnifying glass, so you had the whole thing in one. The new shorter Oxford commentary is kind of like the best compromise. You get 2 big volumes, and there's a lot of material covered, and you can fit it on your shelf. And so it's too bad I don't have volume 1. Yep, so some books on biblical theology there, and some books on Old Testament, some random books. Some of them are I've used them in some papers. Maybe I've had them, just pick them up over the years. Some decent books. I've got some more on C.S. Lewis here. That biography is a great biography by Alistair McGrath, even though it's upside down. On my shelf there, there's a little DVD series on C.S. Lewis. So yeah, basically that's it. On the end of this shelf, I have some of my publications that were in journals. So those kind of 3 volumes there. I've got one other I don't have the physical journal because I have to buy it. So too much of an insult, so I didn't buy it. But yeah, when you publish something, it's sometimes you get a free copy, right, of the issue. So that's about it for that. The front side of the cart are more useful to me, for sure. the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is a Collier Macmillan. I've used it a little bit. It's a good encyclopedia. I picked that up for free at a used book sale. And yeah, I'm not sure it's a standard encyclopedia, but it's pretty good. And for someone like me, again, who's an outsider, when I want to look something up, and I'm saying rather than Google something, or if I can't find a good article I want to supplement, like the Stanford Encyclopedia, which is online, sometimes I'll pick that up and I'll look at it.
What about
I have, yeah, I've used that as a reference a number of times. So that's kind of a dictionary of biblical texts and ideas in, as it says, in English literature. So it's kind of nice actually when you're looking for, it's not technical like the Syntopicon, but it has articles in it. And when you're looking for, hey, like, is there, there's a major text, maybe, I don't know, maybe they're like the prologue to the Gospel of John or something like that. And this is kind of featured in various eras of English literature by some major authors who would kind of echo this, allude to it, maybe mention it. Where has it been significant? That's what that dictionary does. And it's actually quite useful in that regard. The Oxford Classical Dictionary I use all the time. And so the thing is, I like that edition there, the third edition there, which is the third revised edition. I got that edition because I read there are a number of errors in the fourth edition. It may have some updates in it, but as you know, it's not always the case that every new edition is better. And sometimes new editions introduce errors and they take things out that you really like, or maybe they start to modulate some of the wording. And I read one of the reviews of the fourth edition, I believe, and it kind of concerned me. It's not a big deal. The fourth edition is probably still excellent, but I thought, the third edition is way cheaper and perhaps they're more parallel. So I picked up the third edition. And
those changes can sometimes even be much more significant, like really ideological changes where a different sort of paradigm is introduced in terms of defining terms. And that's a big issue with the Dictionary of the History of Ideas. And then when they moved it to the new Dictionary of the History of Ideas, it was a complete ideological shift. And I'm going to be doing a video on those. They're really great works for intellectual historians and just people interested in history of ideas.
Well, it's yeah, you're right, and it's a problem. So I mean, there's the classic example in the Encyclopedia Britannica, and you may remember what edition is it? Is it the 11th edition or something? There's a time when you can go back to the Encyclopedia Britannica, and I'm not saying this is the most reliable edition, but there's a time at which that encyclopedia drastically changes, and it no longer represents what you would call an older view of the world from those scholars who put that together. Yes, with many prejudices, many cultural prejudices, that's true, but also a number of presuppositions which were just redolent of the old world and our older understanding, and that's lost. Now, of course, being politically correct and being even academically accurate, many people would say, well, with good riddance, because we have better understandings in newer work. And that's, in many ways, that's true, especially in the encyclopedia, because it still doesn't represent to the most kind of contemporary kinds of ideological changes. But there is something you lose. I think there's a book you can buy, which is like, has readings from that old edition and of the Encyclopedia Britannica, and it has like excerpts, and I'd have to go find the book, but it's a 1-volume book, and it has like, the purpose was to kind of show like the kind of quirky things that were in that book, and I'd have to go look up what the name of the volume was. But you're right, and actually sometimes what I like to do, and I've got a book there to the left of the Encyclopedia of Philosophy, is that Fowler's Modern English Usage. There is a newer edition of that, but this new Fowler's English usage is from the 90s, and it's contemporary enough that anything you read in it it's still within our generation. And so you're not using archaic or antiquated English at all. But it has the supreme benefit of not being produced. I think, and I'd have to double check, the most recent edition is post 2014 or 2015 or something. And this volume has the supreme benefit of not being that. And so many of us don't necessarily think it's a great idea to continually update these kinds of resources with contemporary language. And, as someone who studies language, I get it. Language changes, and that's just the nature of language. So you want to do the usage at the time. That's how we understand language. I think most speakers, though, can be pretty critical when because you know the kind of the register and discourse that we use in contemporary language. When you want to learn about language, I think better to get some of these sources that are just new enough to keep you totally current, but old enough to you're not kind of being weighed down by ideology and rapid changes because of the internet. And so I prefer not to have a book that tells me something since the internet, we have this new term and this is what we do. I think, well, I already know that because I live in that world. I'd kind of like something which came from a time before that. And so I really love finding books from the 90s because they also were published as the internet was coming up. So you get some great reference works that were to be eclipsed by the internet. And so sometimes they're forgotten because the internet just kind of consumed everything into the late 90s and early 2000s. But then you can find those great books which are just there. And they're from that time, and they were written when the internet was no one really knew what it was going to become. And they can sometimes be lost gems. And I love reading books on language in English and dictionaries. And that Fowler's Modern English, I've taken it with me many times just to read it. And so that has little short articles on, you'll say English versus American spelling of this word. And it'll have maybe a paragraph on, how it's been used, how it used to be used, how it's used at the time of writing, the differences in spelling. It's just great. It answers many questions that you might have.
What's the deal with this Dreyer's English?
Yeah, the Dreyer's English by Benjamin Dreyer, or Dreyer, is I think he was the chief copy editor at Penguin Random House. Is it Random House? Yeah, it's Random House. And he wrote a book on English style, and it's funny, easy to read. He had a card game too that I got with it, but I never really used it. It's kind of fun to test your ability with finding the errors, and it's kind of a classic style guide. So it's got a lot of discussion of classical errors and issues. He's got a little bit more of a traditional bent too, even though he's funny and kind of writes at a very common level. But there are errors. There are right ways to say things and wrong ways to say them. And it's a really refreshing book. If someone's I think I'm interested in kind of language and fluency, would be a good idea to become more fluent in my mother tongue, but I don't want to get a book like Fowler's English, or I'm not going to read, Strunk and White, the whatever Strunk and White's Elements of Style or something. Dreyer's English is it's a good book.
Is this good? The Key Ideas?
Yep, it's a great little book. If you are interested in linguistics and philosophy of language, they've great articles. It's short. Is that by Sheffield? Or is that by? No, University of Edinburgh. And yeah, it's great. I mean, when I'm not a linguist, I did some study in linguistics in my PhD. Because my supervisor is a linguist, and that book is really helpful. Yeah, some other random books here that I've had for years, and then some German books. Studied German in my PhD, so the Castle's Wörterbuch is standard dictionary, really good, and then some German textbooks. The top of the shelf is a lot of background, so Complete Work to Josephus, use all the time. Source book by Barrett. Some of these are, again, this isn't like perfectly organized. Most of these are historical backgrounds of the New Testament. All of them good books. I keep these, or I have them, because they are good books. Some of them I've just picked up because they're at a book sale, but they're by great authors. I have, like, Hans Conzelmann was a great German New Testament scholar, history of primitive Christianity. I haven't read, but it should be a decent book. I've looked at it. Yeah, the book by Van Voorst is probably the best book on the historical information for Jesus outside the New Testament. If people are interested in the historical Jesus, it's an excellent book. Those books on the kind of New Testament backgrounds and interpretation, the history. Yeah, this is sort of my field. I've used a lot of these books. That book, A Guide to Biblical Commentaries, might be interesting if someone's interested in biblical commentaries and reference works. It's the author who wrote that has done, it's in its 10th edition, so you can tell it's popular. He's done great work, and he's basically gone through all the major commentaries and reference works on the Bible, and he has annotations on all the series, on all the major works, and he kind of categorizes them and talks about their strengths, their weaknesses. He has sometimes cite reviews of them, so it's really good. I got that when I was in my first theology degree, like many years ago, and I really liked that book a lot. It was very helpful to kind of sift through, like, what's a book worth getting, for example.
What about this Magic and Paganism in Early Christianity?
That's a series of lectures, actually, by an excellent scholar called Hans Josef Klauck. And it's lectures on the book of Acts. So the book of Acts is my specialty. And he's kind of putting Acts, and it's called Magic and Paganism. He's sort of putting Acts in its kind of Hellenistic milieu. It's sort of pagan milieu. And he'll comment on sometimes Greek and Roman parallels to what's going on in the book of Acts. And it's a series of lectures, so it's not like a commentary, but it's a great little book. And he's a great scholar. Yep, some Bibles there, and some random stuff there.
Okay, so that wraps up the library cart. Okay, so we're back now here for session 2, and we're starting this new bookcase here.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just say a few words about what the function is of this bookcase here.
So, like, more or less, not everything. There are, like, the bottom shelf, some random things here. This bookshelf is basically some things I want immediate to hand. So a lot of my Greek stuff is here. A lot of the books I have, like some commentaries, not all of them. We saw some in the other shelves, but commentaries, especially stuff on the Gospels, but in particular Acts, some biblical reference material on the top of the shelf. And this was stuff that, again, the shelf isn't big enough to have everything at hand that I would want to. And because my library is sort of spread out across many rooms, there's a little bit of disorganization. Some things I have to my right-hand side, in theory, could be on my left-hand side. I could probably take some things off these shelves and swap them out for things I have in the other room. But basically, this is Greek and New Testament exegesis, Book of Acts, some Paul's letters, commentaries, things like that.
Okay, so we can go to the top shelves here. Does anything stand out to you in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I would say everything I have on the top shelf is important. The Anchor Bible Dictionary is like, I still think this is kind of the gold standard encyclopedia or dictionary in the field. There's really nothing like it. And I also love the fact that it's a product of the 1990s. It's a product of the late 20th century. It's kind of a unique time where um, you had a lot of convergences, I think, in the field of biblical studies where you would have so-called, like, I don't really like the terms, but you'd have so-called conservative and liberal scholars, maybe like minimalist, maximalist scholars, whatever. They could sort of like collaborate on a project like this with fairly minimal um, drama or controversy. You don't have major, like, of course, in the 90s you did have major ideological rifts, but you don't really see reference resources like this anymore. Of course, now with online, you have a lot of different kinds of productions you get, but the Anchor Bible Dictionary is, I think, second to none. I got this set. It's like it's brand new. I mean, there's maybe a couple minor scuffs on the spines, but this was like never used. And I think I got it for, like, it wasn't cheap. It was a few $100s at least, like US, and then shipping was a lot of money. But I got this it was a birthday gift from my wife and my family, I think together, went in together on it a couple years ago, maybe.
Did they wrap it up, or did they like do anything special for it, or?
Well, they wrapped it up, but the nice thing is when you get these things off of some of these nice, like, the booksellers that sell these things tend to be ancient world booksellers or humanities booksellers, and they're small little shops. So they tend to package them really nicely. So it came in a shipping box, which I actually really like. And they did wrap that up. But then inside the box, they packaged them very nicely with their kind of slips inside each book. And like even in the book, you'll find this interesting, because I know you mentioned last time some of these advertising materials that you like.
Yep.
And I'm sure I have something in here. Yeah, like you just can't buy this stuff. So you get these kind of advertising cards here. So it's giving you all the information about the Anchor Bible Dictionary, and it's kind of beautiful cardstock. So, and it has the old price, which I think was per volume, $60 or $70 there per volume. But I have at least a few of these in these volumes here. And
So what is it that really, is it just the size of it? I mean, most dictionaries aren't 6 volumes, and these are big volumes, but beyond that, what's real? And you said there wasn't a lot of rancor in terms of it was a time where liberals and conservatives could get along. But beyond that, what is sort of unique about this?
well, when I say dictionary, and yeah, I'm not suggesting that there wasn't, conflicts in the field. Have always been. But anyway, that aside, you can look at the contributors and see what I mean, where they come from. But it says dictionary. It's not like an encyclopedia is probably a more like serviceable descriptor for most people.
Yeah.
Like, some people think dictionary in terms of like this is a glossary of terms, and then you have basic definitions. But in academic dictionaries, you sometimes get what you'd call a dictionary article, and you have quote unquote definitions, which are sometimes thousands of words long, and the definitions of subjects and topics. So it would be the size. It's clearly massive. It kind of represents the best of the field. So at that time, kind of state of the field, experts from around the world in all their respective areas, writing major articles that were also vetted by, as I say, kind of a fairly broad team of editors. So you're not getting, like if you have maybe very conservative reference resources, you get a lot of, there's kind of an insularity, right? And you don't really have someone from another side saying, hold on, let's, look at some other evidence. So it's quite balanced. Maybe some people see that as an academic fiction, but a lot of the articles are excellent. Not everything is great, but a lot of the articles in here are great. And it's sort of like, in my mind, it represents kind of the best of late 20th century scholarship, and it's totally comprehensive for the time. And It doesn't cover everything, but it's very good. I will still take this off the shelf because I like books, and I also tend to think that reading, good dictionaries or encyclopedias, even if they're older, like you get a lot of information. And I often take this up, like when I'm researching something, I'll just go to the Anchor Bible Dictionary, and I'll even though I know, okay, this is going to give me the picture from a generation ago, about 30 years ago. Um, Even so, I'll just read the article, and oftentimes they're pretty good. And to have as sort of a monument to biblical scholarship, I think it's such an important resource. And yeah, I'm sure you could do, like, I've never gone and looked online at, like, um, who out there has said in their respective field, like, what is the Anchor Bible Dictionary has these, like, 20 gems of articles that are like in their fields. But in my field and in my area, yeah, they have good articles on the synoptic problem, good articles on Luke and Acts, good articles on the historical persons of the New Testament, really good articles on the historical background of the New Testament. And so it's still great. It's a really, really good resource. And a beautiful books as well. The ISBE right there is the same kind of thing. It's older. So the ISBE comes from an earlier time, and then it was updated. And so this edition's obviously not that old. I would say the ISBE it's very similar to the Anchor Bible Dictionary. It's not quite as extensive. They have more images in the ISBE, and it's a little bit more, I would say, on the moderate to conservative end of things. At least that's its heritage. Um, and it's not like they created the one to combat the other, but in the field, you'll have, someone starts a major project with one publishing house and one kind of school supporting it. And then they do it. And then the Anchor Bible Dictionary comes along and does their thing. If I had to choose one, it'd be the Anchor Bible Dictionary. But, I don't have to choose. And like there's many times when I can find an article in the one that I can't find in the other. Or the way that they divide articles will be like I'm looking for a topic, and it'll actually have its own article in the ISBE, but in the Anchor Bible Dictionary, it's kind of subsumed under multiple different articles because of the topic. So, there's always like kind of interpretation as to how you should go and set about like crafting a reference resource, like what are suitable topics, how do you put them in a hierarchy and things like that. They're both excellent, and I still use them both.
If I can put you on the spot, do you have a particular favorite article in each one?
I probably don't have a favorite article in each one. I tend not to like read through them, and I'll typically reference them and reference parts of articles. So, I mean, I'd have to spend some time really looking, like what would be interesting to do, which I haven't done, is to compare a few key subjects that I know well and like, and see which one has what I think is a better article. Some of the ones I mentioned in the Anchor Bible Dictionary are good. But no, I haven't picked out like this is just a favorite article. No.
I get I'm going to talk about this more in the video I do on the Dictionary of History of Ideas, but I think there's a lot of meaning often to what is the first article in a reference book like this. And I find that it often tells you a fair amount about the ideology of the, where the editors are coming from. And so that's something that I'll look at, like what do they choose as the first article?
Yeah, that may be true. I mean, these are alphabetical, so you tend to get obviously A words or AA words in the beginning. But definitely when you look at the introductions of these and you say what's the rationale, what's the occasion for it, and what are the editors saying about why it was needed or what updates they made, I think it's very telling for sure.
Mhm.
I should say there are other encyclopedias or dictionaries that I don't own, but there are some great articles in some of these, which I do have in mind as excellent articles. And one series that I don't own, because I think these are better, the ones I have are better, and I would own them, it's just I don't have the money right now. There's a series of dictionaries by I believe they're InterVarsity Press. This would be, for example, like the Dictionary of Jesus and the Gospels. IVP, yes, I think it's an 8-volume set of dictionaries, Dictionary of Paul and his letters, or Dictionary of like the New Testament backgrounds or something. There are some really excellent articles in the previous edition. So there are current editions that have come out like relatively recently, but there's a previous edition, and I'm thinking of there's an article on, this may sound esoteric to some people, but an article on what's called the Pauline chronology. So the chronology of the life of the Apostle Paul. And in the latest edition, it's written by a great scholar, like a scholar who I think should be able to write the definitive article, named Rainer Riesner, a great German scholar who wrote an excellent book on this like decades ago. But I don't think his article is better than the one that preceded him. And it's by a scholar named Loveday Alexander. And she wrote an article on Pauline chronology, which I think is just such a good article. And for people who are interested in kind of historical Paul New Testament chronology, that article by Loveday Alexander is very good. I think in the same volume, and I could be wrong, there's an article on New Testament chronology by Stanley Porter, who was my doctoral supervisor, and I have a number of his books here. And it's also one of those articles that's just very good for the way it lays out kind of a difficult subject area, but it's also got a lot of interest to people, like how do you map the chronology of the New Testament, and what are the hard dates, and how do you relate them to extra biblical resources. So those are a couple that, when you ask me like favorite articles, a couple that come to mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because it just made me think of, I think it's Newton, who one of his like side interests was chronology. And it used to be like several hundred years ago, it used to be like something that a lot of people were really interested in, and was not, there wasn't as much kind of standard knowledge as we have today about like the timeline and just dates of major events. And so there were a lot of famous scholars, scientists, etc., who were working on chronology while they were also doing whatever their main thing was.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm not super familiar with James Ussher's, I think it's, what is it, Chronology of the World or something like that. Bishop Ussher, who's the one who mapped out, supposed to map out history back into the biblical genealogies, and said the earth is, 6,000 and whatever years old that some people believe in. And Ussher has this, and it's funny because a lot of people think, oh, that's so naive. And even if you don't hold to that view of the kind of biblical history, there's people who are called young earth creationists and things like that. I'm not one, but I really don't like the people who kind of pass that scholarship off as sort of outdated and naive, because if you look at Bishop Ussher's work, you realize it's just an incredible work of historical skill and real talent and knowledge. Obviously far more knowledgeable than most scholars today on those kinds of matters, even if there's more sophistication in terms of science and some of the historical record, even the biblical record. To have a singular person produce this kind of resource. So I don't have that book, but that's kind of a well-known book.
Yeah, I looked up, I just want to read out a couple things from AI. So Newton's main chronological work was the Chronology of Ancient Kingdoms Amended, published posthumously in 1728. And it runs through 87,000 words and surveyed the timeline of Greek, Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, and biblical history by 18th century standards. And then Bishop James Ussher, 1581 to 1656, his Annals
Veteris Testamenti, commonly called the Annals of the World, used biblical genealogies, historical sources, and astronomical cycles to calculate a detailed timeline from creation onward. He famously dated creation to the evening before October 23rd, 4004 BC on the
Yep.
proleptic Julian calendar.
I mean, see, you have people from a bygone era who were, and the beautiful thing about it, which I definitely gravitate towards, ideologically, is this notion that of the wholeness and the comprehensiveness of knowledge and reality, where you could say, no, like venerable information that we have or that we hold to, whether it's our knowledge of the natural world and knowledge of, scripture, and trying to bring those things together. And again, a lot of sort of, there's a lot of sophistry around, like, oh, that's all so naive, and let everything kind of be compartmentalized and treated in its own way. But then you had these people who, and we could admit, like, okay, sure, you can always poke many holes in it. And academically, now we want to be responsible in certain ways, and you just can't get away with some of those things. But at the same time, you feel that you've lost something when you no longer have people who are developing a real, dilettante ability. I mean, as lovers of the arts, and I mean that in a positive way, with sciences and history and artifacts and texts, and they're able to bring them together. So anyway, that's kind of a tangent, but yeah, those are those two sets there, and I use them pretty frequently.
I just want to also give Newton's dates. So he was born December 25th, 1642, on the Julian calendar used in England, equivalent to the 4th of January, 1643 in the Gregorian calendar, and then died 1727. So anyways, do you want to move on to the next book here?
Sure. Yeah. Other things on the top of this shelf. Synopsis of the four Gospels that was given to me, and I typically just use the Greek text. This is English text. It's helpful to look at, and there is a you can get a synopsis of the four Gospels in Greek by the same publisher. If it's not the American Bible Society, it's the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft, which is the German Bible Society. But it's just a lot more expensive and harder to find. But I do intend to get.
You pronounce that pretty well. Do you have some German?
Yeah, ich spreche ein bisschen Deutsch. Because when you go to graduate school, you have to, PhD in the humanities, for example, you have to learn German. And so when I say you have to learn German, you have to learn to read German. So I was only required to pass a final exam, which involved taking a page of academic German, and then maybe it was an article. So it was a few pages, an article in my field, and then translating as much as I can within an hour. And then the professor marks it for its accuracy, and it's pass or fail. However, and so you can actually pass an exam like that with a few months of study. But I was interested in German, and so I spent, about a year and a half or so basically doing what I think are really good second language acquisition methods in terms of just acquiring German. So I did a lot of what's called comprehensible input reading in German and some dialogues and things like that. And I left it behind a number of years ago, but I still have basic abilities, I would say. Sometimes I'm surprised at how much I do remember, because at one point I was quite into it, but I haven't really kept up my German. The pronunciation, is fine, because that doesn't really go away. But sometimes I'm opening up academic German books, especially if they're older, like if they're from mid-20th century, and it's quite a slog. I had to slog through a lot of that stuff in my PhD. And I say a lot. I mean, not, there's a decent amount of them.
And is that in black letter?
Some of them, yeah. So some of them, like the older texts, like Friedrich Schleiermacher, maybe we mentioned him before, because he's got things on, when I was doing some in the history of interpretation in some of my chapters, you go back to the earlier authors, and some of those authors are, they're in like Gothic script, and it's not OCR'd. You can't do anything with it except slog through it, and you get treasures for the effort. I mean, when you actually work through things like that, sometimes they're minimal, but you do get insights. And so, I had to do some of that hard work. But
Can you talk about the comprehensible, like what kinds of comprehensible input you used? What companies
I,
might be?
I definitely can. And I was going to mention that when we get to the Greek texts too. So maybe we can
Okay.
pick it up.
Yeah,
with the
that'd be
Greek
good.
text.
We can circle back to that. Okay.
For sure. So there's synopsis. The only other thing there on the shelf, which I would point out, I got a few New Testament introductions. So this book here, the Blue Book, Early Christianity and its Sacred Literature, you can see the name MacDonald and Porter. So I'm going to mention Porter a few times. He's my colleague, was my PhD supervisor. So we're working together now on some writing tasks and some research, some, big things in the pipeline. He's, top tier world New Testament scholar, excellent scholar. That book, I also think, is kind of a hidden gem. It's out of print, so you can't buy it, because typically what you get, I get around that era too, in the 90s, early 2000s, is this is a great book, great authors, great publisher, but you get certain publishers and certain books just consuming everything else. So they really push them, and then they kind of, once the schools, like the seminary circuit, gets a hold of a major textbook, some of these other great textbooks fall to the wayside. So the one beside it, the White Book, is also excellent, by Raymond Brown, the Roman Catholic scholar, An Introduction to the New Testament. But Porter and MacDonald's introduction, the blue one, is really good. I think it's great because they're two experts in things like linguistics, canon, and they bring a lot of kind of specialty there. But they have these great introductory essays that you don't typically find in New Testament introductions about the philosophy of history, the nature of language, the nature of interpretation. And then they go on to all the standard material, like the backgrounds, the introduction. And Lee Martin MacDonald, had a lot of his own experience on the ground. So he traveled to Turkey, Asia Minor, the Bible lands many times. So a lot of his pictures are in the book. And I think it's a really good resource, actually. And it doesn't get as big as it's big, but it doesn't get as big as some of the other ones.
You mentioned something about how once a book hits the seminary circuit, another book will be pushed aside. So is that basic? Could you just explain that dynamic? Because I didn't quite gather what you were saying there.
Yeah, what I mean, not necessarily pushed aside, but what I mean is, imagine you have 5 really good books in an area published around the same time, maybe within a decade or so. But if one of those books and publishers, particularly the big publishers in what I would call the big evangelical publishers, has, if they get the biggest name and they get big marketing and there's a big push, then what tends to happen is that you have kind of it's sort of like a popularity thing, where a lot of mainstream schools will just adopt that book as the quote unquote gold standard. And in the real world, you realize that it's just not always the case that it is the gold standard. It might have certain qualities, like having a nice look to it. It may even have like a really good layout, or a certain thing about it, like to give publishers and authors credit. There's usually something great about very popular books, you would hope anyway. But what I'm saying is that you realize it's often the case that there's always, it's not like gold, silver, bronze, and you can do that with every area. It's usually, there's a handful of books that could really vie for being the top book in that discipline, in terms of, when I say discipline, like in that genre of books. And sometimes the popular one wins out for various reasons, when some of these other books kind of fall to the wayside. And I think that's what happened with this book, because it went out of print. And I compare it with the book beside it, the book 2 Books Down by Donald Guthrie, which is also great. Like they're all great books. I would say those 3 books. And there's another one by Bart Ehrman, which is not as good as these 3, but it's good. I'd say they all maybe equally have their merits. I like the blue one by Porter and MacDonald for personal reasons, but you see some of them get really popular, some of them don't. It's for reasons other than the quality. It's for other reasons, kind of the name, the school, the publisher. So
Okay,
it's
did you want
unfortunate when they go out of print.
Yeah. Did you want to say anything about this one?
Not much. I mean,
Okay.
yeah, Donald Guthrie, it's a really good book. That's his third edition, so it's kind of expanded. I would say it's a little bit simpler to read than the other two, and the nice thing about Guthrie is at the time he's got, a kind of encyclopedic ability with very detailed, covering a lot of things. He's more conservative than Raymond Brown, and maybe Porter MacDonald are kind of middle of the road, a little bit closer to Guthrie, but in between the two.
And then anything about this statue?
Yeah, this is Pachacuti. He's like the great Inca, the great Incan king. And so I'm Peruvian on my mother's side. And
Oh, cool.
the Incan Empire, it's funny because Pachacuti's he's sort of like the Alexander of the Western Hemisphere. And many people don't know, but his empire was massive. And what's interesting when you have the history of imperialism, you tend to get empires spreading east to west because they stay at a certain climate in east to west, where because of the I guess it's longitude, right? You're either, if you're in a warmer area, like you're in the Mediterranean, for example, but the Incan Empire spread north to south. So they were in mountains, they were in deserts, they were, traversing many different climates. And if you had even like a cursory survey of Pachacuti, the Incan Empire, prior to the time of European conquest of Latin America, what we now call Latin America, this was a massive empire. And I'm not saying, this is I've been to Peru many times. I think, 7 or 8 times for about a month each time. And my parents have been, dozens of times because my family's there. I'm not saying they were an idyllic civilization. Definitely a lot of violence and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of terrible things that happened in those cultures too, but there's also some beautiful things about them, and the mythology is very interesting as well.
Do you know what animal that is?
That's not an animal, that's a face, and then there's feathers on top, so a headdress. And then on his chest, he has the plate in the face as well, and I believe that would be the goddess Viracocha, which is like and I'm rusty on my Peruvian history of Viracocha. Let me make sure. Viracocha is like the creator god, and I believe that would be Viracocha's face, like Viracocha on the plate, the nameplate. And yeah, I'd have to go look up anything else if wanted to speak. The only other thing is on the bottom of his robe there, you have you can see a little, it looks like a symbol there. Yeah, it's called a chicana. And what's interesting about that, I have it somewhere. Yeah, what's interesting about the chicana, you can see it here. It's like an 8-sided cross. And it's their own symbol. But of course, when Europeans came who were Catholic, there was a story about, I believe these were Catholic. Either they were conquerors or missionaries, and sometimes they were the same people, which is kind of a scary thought. But this was adopted as sort of an Incan cross because they said, look, it's a cross. It's just an 8-sided cross. And there's a story of some, divine protections with this chicana or something. So I've always liked the chicana in its own right, but it was also Christianized, and it's interesting how it is a cross, because you have Christianization of many things throughout history when in Christian empires, but this was sort of ready-made to be Christianized. I don't know how Christianized it was, but I'm saying there's some some kind of writing about it.
So, where do you want to get started on this shelf?
Yeah, I should probably power through. My problem is I can talk a lot, and
I'm a big
some
fan
things
of reference stuff, so I always like spending a little bit extra time there.
Yeah, well, for sure. And there's a few more reference things here. Dictionary of Biblical Criticism and Interpretation is good. It's a good basic dictionary with Routledge, edited by Porter. That's the name I mentioned before. These 2 volumes beside it by William Baird, History of New Testament Research. There's a third, and they kind of go from like best to okay to not as great. In the third volume, which isn't as good, I don't have. But the first volume of his History of New Testament Research is very good. Just the quality of research, the breadth of research, so the illumination that he has on kind of the pre-modern or pre-critical era, and then the early biblical criticism is really good. So this is basically these 3 volumes would constitute a history of New Testament interpretation from prior to the rise of, say, modern biblical criticism in the like 18th and 19th centuries up until the modern period. And they're really good. Just kind of need to have if you are into New Testament studies, for example. Just a few books here on New Testament backgrounds, New Testament. Well, that one by Kruger is more of a 2nd century book, but the others there. Some New Testament backgrounds, some Gospels. This is sort of random. I would say Gospels, Gospel backgrounds, Gospel issues. Some popular books there, like trade paperback books, like Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus or Can We Trust the Gospels? F.F. Bruce's New Testament Documents, Are They Reliable? That little skinny book there is a great little essay on the rise of Christianity by Jan Bremer. And what he does in this book is he compares the work of Adolf Harnack, of Gibbon, and you'll be familiar with Gibbon's rise and fall of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, and Rodney Stark's book, The Rise of Christianity. So I really like this book by Jan Bremer because he has some kind of nuanced takes comparing different scholars from different eras on the rise of Christianity. And this was a really good essay. I believe it was an inaugural lecture he did somewhere or something, but the kind of thing you like to have, because some people get attached to simply like a Stark or like Rodney Stark, who's got a great popular book, but or like a Bart Ehrman, who's got a popular book on this topic. But sometimes you get real venerable scholars who've got little lesser known essays, and that's one of them. Some books on the Synoptic Gospels and Gospel backgrounds. A book by Paul Barnett, Making the Gospels. That's a good book. Paul Barnett's a great author, great historian. Richard Bauckham's Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. That's a very popular book. I think Bauckham's a great historian. That book became like kind of really made him a quote unquote household name for a lot of people interested in studying the Gospels and historical Jesus. Also creates controversy because people disagree with him, but I think he's sort of stood the test of time in many ways.
Could you just say a few words, like just a sentence or two about what eyewitnesses means, like who that would be?
Yes. So what Richard Bauckham is referring to here are the authors of the Gospels, and he takes them to be eyewitnesses. So people who were students of Jesus or disciples, even if he doesn't take the traditional view in every case, he's saying, look, these texts aren't maybe literary productions of a later generation. They are the products of eyewitnesses, people who were with Jesus. And he has many arguments for that. He looks at like name statistics. He looks at 2nd century texts in the early Christian tradition. He looks at the texts themselves and their various, evidences within the texts. And, he was trained as a historian. He was he is, and I think he's not retired. I'm not sure. an academic historian and New Testament scholar. So he tends to be a little bit more on the moderate/conservative wing, but because those are his conclusions, not because he has some sort of ideology. I don't think. And yeah, it's a good book. It's a really good book. Some commentaries here. Nothing special. I mean, well, I say nothing special. That one on Luke by Erhard Marshall is a model commentary. So sometimes people think, like, what kind of commentary should I buy? These are all decent commentaries, but some are better than others. I think Erhard Marshall's commentary on Luke's Gospel is a model exegetical commentary. And he was one of those scholars who could do theology well and Greek language and what's called exegesis, so kind of explaining the Greek text well, and he had a good handle on history. So that's a really good commentary. Nothing else major there. I mean, there's these 4 volumes on the Book of Acts. So, I mean, I have these on my shelf with my other Acts stuff. What to say about these? Well, they're huge. They're definitely big. That's for sure. Like, so this is one commentary. So to put it in perspective, that commentary on Luke that I just mentioned is a big commentary on the Gospel of Luke, which is about 20,000 words long in the New Testament. The Book of Acts is the second volume by the same author, Luke, in the New Testament, of similar length, about 20,000 words in the New Testament. And that commentary on Luke is pretty big, right? This has got to be 800 pages or so, I would say. Well, it's 930 pages on Luke. And then you have now 5,000 pages, basically, on Acts. So what's going on there? Well, what's going on there is, I would say, obsession, which is probably interesting in many ways. There's a lot of duplication. I read through a disturbing amount of the first volume. I say disturbing. I don't sound negative. Disturbing not for the author, for me, because it's reading a lot. Like the introduction's as long as some commentaries. And you do have a lot of repeated paragraphs and sentences, but it does reflect an amazing amount of work by a major historian of early Christianity in the New Testament, Craig Keener. And I'm not sure it's like, I think it shoots itself in the foot a little bit, with all due respect. And I when I say all due respect, I mean, Craig Keener is a great historian. He, of course, I can't think of anyone else who could do what he did. And clearly meticulous, I would probably obsessed, many, many years. And he has so much knowledge of ancient literature. But the reason why it shoots itself in the foot, for someone who is doing high-level study of the Book of Acts, is that when a commentary is so big, you begin to assume that it's virtually an encyclopedia. And so you expect it to answer every question. But of course it doesn't, because no one resource can. And so I found, like, it says exegetical, and that wasn't his choice. That was the publisher's choice, I believe, because it's not an exegetical commentary. And what that means is he's not going to answer a lot of your questions on the Greek text. But the problem with doing so much history is you ask yourself the question, what is a historical commentary? And how do you know what history is relevant to a text? Because in theory, you could keep pulling that thread and you could unravel it into the whole history of the world at the time. And I think that is a challenge for many scholars. Of course, I think about this in my own work because I'm working on a historical commentary on the Book of Acts. And of course, I see him as a model in many ways, but also you realize you need to manage people's expectations properly, and you need to say thus far and no farther. And I think the text really needs to set the tone. So you need a good theory of what a text is and a good theory of what a historical interpretation is. I'm not saying he doesn't have that, but again, when it's so big, you realize, oh, he's got to have a really good treatment of this issue. And when you don't find it there, of course, it's nothing against him because you don't find it in many books. But then he did 5,000 pages. Now, all my kind of critical, because I can be critical. This is my field, so you get critical things in your field as other people would be of me. I think that these 4 volumes are gonna, long outlive all of us, and I think they'll really serve their turn. They're incredible, and if there are people who think I want to know something about Acts and history, your best bet is to look up Craig Keener, because he has a lot, I should just say, leave it there, full stop. He's got a lot.
The thing that's kind of, I think of when I see these in particular, because Jason Johnston also has these, and to me, they're sort of iconic of the whole Brill, kind of this purple series. I think they're the biggest set within that set.
You might be thinking of, so this is Baker. That B is the publisher, Baker, not Brill.
Okay.
And there is a Brill series, which is an encyclopedia on the history of Christianity, which has similar color. There's also a major Brill, like encyclopedia of ancient history, called New Pauly, I think it might be that color as well.
So
But
this
is
standalone. Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah.
What I was thinking is these kind of show, and I'm curious what your perspective on this would be, like people who set a challenge of reading the entire Bible cover to cover. They've never read the Bible before. They set a challenge to read the entire thing in maybe a year. And I don't know, it seems, I don't know how much you can get from that when you don't have some kind of, you don't necessarily need something like this, but at least maybe a study Bible. So I'm curious, like, how you maybe think about the different levels of apparatus that somebody might need and like what the level of understanding one can have without all this historical knowledge, because there's so much that's out of context in a way.
Well, that's a really good point. So there's a couple things you say there. It's true. I mean, you can read the Bible devotionally, and I do find a lot of people are even unsuccessful when they set themselves. It's a big, I mean, to read through the Bible in a year is a big goal. You're talking about reading at least 3 chapters a day, and some days more. And to read with understanding is a real challenge. Now, when you see books like this, you think, I would never be able to read one book of the Bible, because look at all this knowledge I need to have, which kind of underscores the point I was making. At least for the layperson, of course, you don't need that knowledge. You don't need all that. That can't be true. For the scholar, yeah, there's a lot of interest material there. I think, there's a Bible I have over here that probably we mentioned the other day, or at least we passed by it. I really like this Bible. It's my favorite Bible that I have. It's the old Oxford Annotated Bible, the RSV, not the NRSV or the ESV. It's sort of the dad of those two modern, and I like this translation better. But the thing I like about it is that it's an annotated. It's not a study Bible. You get annotations that are, no more than 4 to 6 lines at the bottom of the page. Really nothing more. And then at the front of each book, you'll have a short article. Like, we're talking a page, maybe 2 pages, not even, like that. And I do think most people would do well with even maybe more than this, like a study Bible. Sometimes you can get like a 1-volume Bible commentary. So you can read your Bible and the Bible commentary. And if you set yourself a goal to do that in 2 or 3 years, at a pace of a chapter a day, take you 3 years to do that, say, I mean, this is a marathon. It's not a sprint. And I always tell people, I try to sort of encourage people in my role as a pastor, like young people that I work with. The thing is consistency. It's not about what I would say constancy. It's not about saying I'm going to read 5 chapters every single day, and be constantly doing this, because you find people burn out and then they stop. But it's better to do a little bit, and to be, like the tortoise and the hare, slow and steady wins the race. And but I like this Bible because I think, if you have a good basic knowledge, or you have a 1-volume Bible commentary and you say, I want a Bible that is pretty much only the biblical text and it has a minimal apparatus just to aid me a little bit while I'm reading, that's actually a great Bible there.
Do you have a sense of, like, as you've learned more and more about Acts, do you feel like there's a diminishing returns in terms of the spiritual value of the additional knowledge? Like, I'm just curious how that changes, or what that's like when you sort of decide to dedicate yourself to a particular book and really get to know it inside and out, and what that's like, year by year by year.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, kind of important question, because there is a perception of that at some point, but I believe if you push further, you find that the opposite is true. You really do, if you study with the right kind of mentality, you really do come around to, I think, deeper insights on the other side. And it's sort of like, you start out here, and then maybe at some point deep in your study, you come to this perceived apex where you feel kind of distant from the meaning which you once attached to it. But as you keep going, and you push through and you study more, you kind of it's not that you come back around, but you do have a richness to it. And as long as a person's not doing what I would consider is trivia. So I would make a distinction between studiousness and curiosity. And those are that's a classical virtue and vice. So in terms of classical Christian theology, there's a Latin virtue in terms of what, say, early Christians would see as the virtue of studiousness, and Latin studiositas, and the vice of curiosity, or curiositas. And this is kind of, we don't really have it in English anymore. We actually invert those two. So you tend to think someone who's curious is like, that must be kind of that's an attractive student. Who's a curious person really is an open-minded person. And then the picture of the studious person is like bookish and chained to their desk and rigid. But in the tradition, those are reversed. And studiousness is supposed to be actually this kind of broad desire to understand, and a virtuous desire to understand, to have a deeper understanding for the purpose of acquiring truth, inspiring truth in others, having a real confrontation and engagement with truth. Whereas curiosity was seen as the lust of the eyes, and a lustful desire to know, and it becomes triviality. So the almost unanimous early interpretation of that text in 2 John, which says that the way the world and its order is passing away, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, people tend to take that as saying the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eyes are synonymous vices, like they're kind of sexual vices. One of them has to do with what you see, and then one of them has to do with what you do with your body, but they're the same species. But the consensus of the early interpretation of that text is not that. It's that the lust of the flesh is a sexual vice, but the lust of the eyes is a vice of curiosity, vicious desire to know trivia. And I think that many scholars do kind of descend into esotericism, triviality. And you see this in, like, you take history, for example, where not that I want to, I'm sure that there could be historians who can make a good defense for some things that they do, but when you look at some works in biblical studies or history and they become totally esoteric, I'm talking about like, here's a history of the shape of gears in like 17th century early industrial, like, this town in England, and you realize this is not written for anybody. It's not written for more than 2 scholars in the world, and it's purely esoteric. Yes, it's knowledge, but it contributes nothing other than getting someone a degree or someone having something to say in the discourse of an increasingly small and emaciated field with little relevance to human life. So, long answer to your short question is, if you go about it the wrong way, yes, I think it can totally denigrate your ability to have a real meaningful understanding or hermeneutical experience with the text. If you go about it the right way, and instead of mere curiosity, you have a studiousness, you have a sort of meticulousness about you, there's an aim and a goal, and it's for understanding truth, then it can feed it. And I've found that when I've been able to do the latter, and I've tried to do the latter, it's only actually enriched and nourished that ability. And I agree with F. Bruce, who once said that if you want to be a good theologian, you first must be a historian. And I've found that it's only when I've gotten a picture of the history and the language that I've really been able to start tying together the bigger theological picture.
I really like that in terms of the studious versus curiosity. I guess, I was actually thinking when you mentioned the statistical name studies, it's sort of like an interesting element of what I would like. There's a analogy in science of like basic research, which you don't always know why it's going to be useful, because it's usually government funded because there isn't an immediate application. And so I wonder if there's kind of you don't always know whether some manuscript is going to be particularly useful hundreds of years later. And so trivia would have to be defined maybe in terms of the intent of the scholar, not necessarily because the scholar may not actually know the usefulness of what they're doing. I'm just curious how you would think about something like that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't define trivia as like little pieces of information with apparently little meaning. I would define trivia more along the lines of the aims and the goals of a project, and what kind of knowledge for its own sake are you acquiring? I think something like name data is a good example. So there's a scholar, Tal Ilan, who has these multiple volumes of Jewish personal names, and I believe also Greek personal names, if not Greek, then Jewish personal names in the Hellenistic and Roman world. And that has served a lot of research. And I don't see that as trivial at all. I don't think that a scholar needs to go and say, look, I've shown how my work contributes to the humanitarian spirit of the West. I think that, as you say, that's good groundwork, and that's good basic science, and it's good basic research. So I want to be careful there to nuance it.
Is there a term for basic that's like analogous to basic science within your type of research, or like biblical criticism?
There probably is a German term, and I probably like Grundforschung or something, but I don't know it. But Germans always have terms. About basic science, I'm assuming, is also a translation of like some German term of like Grundwissenschaft or something, but I don't know.
So I also looked up, because I could have sworn this was part of a series, and the AI is saying there's something called the Baker Exegetical Commentary on the New Testament that this is part of.
So it's not.
It's
not.
Okay.
No, the Baker. I'm sure I have one around here somewhere. Yeah. So this is the Baker Exegetical Commentary series. That's what they used to look like. Okay. And the new ones don't look like this or like Keener's, but it is Baker, and it is an exegetical commentary, but it's not part of any series. It's standalone. and they do some standalone commentaries. Like, for example, Baker also published a commentary on the pastoral epistles by Stanley Porter, whom I mentioned before, which is a big commentary. It's not 4 volumes. It's like one size of one of those volumes. And it's also a Baker commentary on the Greek text, but it's not in the Baker exegetical series. And so Baker does these standalones that could fit in their series, but they're kind of standalones.
Okay. Yeah, because it's not really the same color of purple. It's like a darker tone.
Yeah, and the kind of annoying thing is if you look really closely, these are 4 different shades of blue. Like, definitely you can see number 2 there is almost purple. And like, compare number 1 and number 2, you can see a difference there for sure.
Yeah.
And you always assume they just have a file they can go back and click, like, do this, do that. Here's the RGB code or whatever. But I say they're 4 different. Maybe volumes 3 and 4 are the same, but 1 is the most blue, and then 2 is the most purple. It's just, I don't know. It's just weird.
Do you have any quick stories about the knife here or the shear? Is that a shear?
I made that with a friend, and we went to I have nothing other than I made that, and it's sharp. So. Okay, so here's more stuff on Acts. The big red one on the left was my dissertation. So, it looks absolutely massive, but the writing's only on one side. So it's about 400 pages, but it's only on one. Like, the way that they print it out is you don't get the writing on both sides. It's just one-sided. That's why it looks so big. But it's just 8.5 and 11 by 11 paper with writing on one side.
In my initial email to you, I commented on the use of the word puzzle. And so I was curious if maybe you could talk a little bit about how you chose that metaphor.
Yeah, well, when you do ancient history, and you can see, like, in one sense, a lot of these critical New Testament questions are just manifestly historical questions. This is a discipline of history. You get this, you're kind of confronted with a situation where you have evidence and then you don't have evidence. And I would say that the task of historians has always been, whether they've put it in these terms or not, but at least contemporary philosophers of history would say that what historians do when they do what they do best, and when they're clearly doing the work of history, is they do explanations. So they give historical explanations for the evidence that we have. They try to explain causes, provenance. They try to, what I would say is, put in the missing puzzle pieces in order to make a coherent picture. Now, you can always put a puzzle together in different ways, but the question is, who's putting it together most coherently with the most relevant evidence? And that's why I use that term. And so I spent a lot of time in the early chapters of the dissertation kind of outlining a methodology of history and historiography. Some of it I mentioned in our last time we met, in terms of the kind of this goal of explanation and arriving at kind of a knowledge of the past and things like that. So that's why I use that word puzzle, because in the New Testament, you basically have this picture where, long story short, Jesus was a figure of historical controversy early on in the rise of biblical criticism, because they said, well, we apprehend Christ by faith, but then there's this quote unquote historical Jesus. So you have the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And pretty early on, some German higher critics like David Friedrich Strauss, who was a student of Ferdinand Christian Bauer, they kind of deconstructed the Gospels, and that was like pretty influential. And what a lot of German scholars turned to was Paul as this sort of so-called second founder of Christianity, as a scholar Wilhelm Vrede called him, in this sort of second generation of historical Jesus quests. And Paul became this figure of extreme interest at the height of biblical criticism, the earliest generation of biblical criticism, because we have letters from Paul. And so when people were looking for, like, where's the fundament, where's the historical foundation of earliest Christianity, it's Paul and his letters, because the stories of Jesus come later. Now, many scholars, of course, pushed back on historical Jesus, and that's another discussion about, I mentioned, for example, like Richard Bauckham in our generation, but in previous generations, they'd already been pushing back for a long time. But anyways, Paul became this figure of controversy, and the real issue is that you also have the book of Acts, which contains a large narrative of Paul and his life. And these seem to fill in gaps, but also conflict in many ways. So there's a real problem and puzzle in the New Testament itself, let alone, not to mention the 2nd century texts, which mention Paul, to the 4th century and other controversies. But I focused on the New Testament and the issue of chronology and theology and Paul's letters versus Acts, and a lot of these kind of major conflicts over the centuries. And I had my own sort of solution, my own approach to the language and history, and it's going to be published. So in a published form, slightly expanded, also edited, with Routledge Books. And that will be coming out later this year.
So the height of that controversy, was that like 1800s?
Yeah, this was, so I say the height of the controversy, it's still going on.
Yeah.
But the early height of the controversy, yeah, like mid-19th century.
Okay.
F.C. Bauer published a majorly influential book called Paul the Apostle of Jesus Christ, where he kind of, staked his claim on the book of Acts, and ever since then it's been debated. So you have two sets here on the book of Acts. One of them on the left is from about a century ago, and it was edited by mainly two scholars, so Kersop Lake and a scholar named F.J. Fowkes Jackson. And there were others who helped him as well. So Henry Cadbury was another one. And this is basically, I think this serves the purpose of what you would expect Keener's commentaries to do. So this is the kind of thing that is more like an encyclopedia on the book of Acts. They also agree with kind of the story I was painting before. Acts becomes this like central window into earliest Christianity, a center of problems and promise, kind of. And this represents kind of mainstream American scholarship at the like kind of turn in early 20th century. So it's kind of moderate, some critical scholarship, some little more conservative treatments. And I still think that there's a lot of stuff in here, which is really good. So they have a volume, the first volume there is background, like historical backgrounds, which is great. I mean, these are great historians for their time. Dated, yeah. So they're even, like, they're not aware of the discoveries later in the 20th century, but really good stuff. Volume 2 is a great treatment of, say, the criticism of Acts. So they have essays on like the sources of Acts, the historical tradition, a case for the tradition, a case against the tradition. They have all these essays, really, really good. There's a volume on the text, so the Greek manuscripts. There's a volume that's actually a commentary, which in its own right is good. And then the last volume is notes. It's a series of notes. Not like little footnotes, but many little articles on issues. And that's kind of an example of like a more encyclopedic treatment of a book. And that represents, as I say, mainstream American scholarship from about a century ago. And then beside it is kind of moderate / conservative-ish, British, international, but this is out of the auspices of Tyndale House in Cambridge, scholarship on Acts. It's not the same thing as that other 5 volumes. This is more like you've got, well, the spines tell you, you have kind of different approaches to Acts and different historical issues, and then there are a series of essays, minus the 3rd volume, which is a monograph on Paul's Roman custody. and that was someone's PhD dissertation. So I think that's really cool. You really never see that where someone's published a PhD in as a standalone volume in a series like that. So for that author, that's a really cool opportunity that he had to do that.
Another Porter.
Yeah, there's I mean, the thing about Porter is not only is he my teacher, he's sort of my great teacher and supervisor, he's also written literally dozens of books in New Testament and Greek. And so I do have quite a bit of Porter there. That book, Paul and Acts, was one of the books I read early on in my study of Acts. And that's kind of what, like, I was already working with him. And while I had done a directed study with him when I was doing MA courses, but that's the book that, like, Porter's known for his Greek work. But that book, when I read that, I was like, yeah, we can definitely do something. I can definitely study under him for my dissertation and get real great expert guidance, because that book is excellent. And he's dealing with not the same as what I talked about there with my dissertation, but the same general area.
What was it about Acts in the first place that made you focus on it as opposed to another book?
A number of things. So, yeah, without talking too much, I would say that Acts is, well, if you know the New Testament, I think Acts already seems unique. You say it's not a gospel, it's not a letter, it's a massive history. And that's kind of like Adolf von Harnack called it, like, he said, if the New Testament is like an edifice with two wings, and Acts is like the thing that holds the wings together. And in the book of Acts, you have this connection with the Gospels because of Luke. So Luke, Acts is the two volumes. And so you kind of like, you bring Acts into the ambit of the Gospels and their kind of history, their criticism and everything. But then you also have this the last 2/3 of Acts deal with Paul. And so you're in the world of Paul's letters and the history of Paul. So Acts I was attracted to because I love ancient history, and it's the one book in the New Testament where you get the sense that this is really a movement within the first century, like Greek and Roman world. Yes, it's the Roman world, but of course, this is a Greek text. And so, yes, it's the only book in the New Testament where the historical Jesus and Peter and Paul are present in the narrative. Of course, Jesus at the beginning, Paul, closer to the middle and end. But then you get not only the church in Jerusalem that's kind of going out into the places that students of history become familiar with, like what we would say modern day Turkey or Asia Minor or Anatolia. And you get time in Greece. So Paul's in Athens. You have mention of, like, just in general, even when I was younger, attracted to stories where very brief comments, but, mention of gods and gods from the Greek and Roman world, and then Greek philosophers and the things that are like, this is kind of it's an amazing narrative. Yes, you get Zeus and Hermes when Paul and Barnabas are in Lystra, and it's kind of this amazing narrative. And then when you get into it, you realize it was also the center of this great controversy in the field, and it's connected to the Gospels and Paul. So for me, it was like, yes, I want to keep studying Acts. And then the Greek language is a little bit more sophisticated than much of the rest of the New Testament as well. And so, yeah, I could definitely say more, but those would be the big things. And when you realize if history kind of precedes theology, then starting here with what many different scholars have seen is like, this is really the big obstacle you need to either overcome, or it's rather your foundation for doing a New Testament history. Then if you want to kind of do the history in order to understand the thought world, why not start with Acts?
Is there a historical book in the Old Testament that you have you would either see as analogous to Acts or is sort of your favorite for similar reasons?
Analogous? No, it's hard to say. No, I mean, probably Genesis would be the one that I always think is, yeah, I mean, of course it's massive. Yes, it's the beginning. It's the beginning for a reason. But Genesis, you do get this sort of like excitement of what do you do with the first 11 chapters? What do you do with the creation account? And then you have this sort of whole historical tradition starting with Abraham and, all these major figures. You can make a case for Exodus as well because of the significance of Exodus. I've always liked Daniel, and of course, Daniel's is a prophetic book. But I've always thought that, in Daniel, for those who are interested in the New Testament, you kind of do get this treatment of, this prophetic treatment, and depending on when someone dates that book, where you're sort of, sometimes people make a big bifurcation between the world of the New Testament and the Old Testament. But when you think about the exile and how that kind of links up with the eventual history of the New Testament, yeah, Daniel's one of those books which always kind of stood out to me. Is there an analogous book? I don't think so. I mean, the Old Testament, the structure of the Old Testament is very different. And if you take the Jewish structure of the Tanakh, it has a much more comprehensive canonical structure. The Old Testament does in terms of symmetrical, and there's a certain kind of coherence to it, which the New Testament lacks in terms of its form and structure, where the New Testament has 4 Gospels, 1 history, a bunch of letters, a couple, you could say they're homilies or sermons or whatever, and then an apocalypse. And the New Testament seems more like it's a collection of kind of historical and occasional works, whereas the Old Testament seems like it's a lot more of a collection of this sort of like literary whole. And the Hebrew scholars, at least they make these claims about the word count, the symmetrical word count in the Tanakh, and you don't have that in the New Testament. The New Testament seems a lot more like we have a number of these reports and traditions, and we're putting them together because they're like what happens when you have the event of Jesus, and then you have this explosion in those next 2 generations of the next generation and a half, I would say, of history, letter. You got to put Revelation in there, but I mean history and letter, basically. And maybe there's not a perfect analogy to Acts for that reason. Mm-hmm. 2 things to mention there without going on too much, but there's that little book by Henry Cadbury. So it's the yellow and white spine there, thin book, The Book of Acts and History. I would say that if someone wants to get into history, the Book of Acts in its historical context, that you don't want to read 5,000 pages. This book is, I would say it's second to none, really. Maybe there's another book. I don't have it on my shelf, but sort of 500-page book on a similar topic by another scholar called Colin Hamer. But this book by Cadbury is like, anyone could read it. It's like 150 pages, and it's so good at putting Acts within its historical setting, commenting on artifacts, documents, historical institutions in a way that doesn't have any real driving agenda. I mean, Cadbury was sort of moderate, middle-of-the-road scholar, so he's not trying to prove anything one way or another. He's simply trying to say, if you look at the historical context, it just illuminates Acts, and so that's a really good book.
Do you see any interesting parallels in terms of Acts as sort of the early Christianization of the empire and later Christianity spreading to Europe, to Latin America, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, definitely Acts is the beginning. By the end of Acts, if you go by its numbers, you do have some number of thousands of Christians. Christianity doesn't really spread through the Roman Empire in terms of conversion until the 4th century. At that point, you have probably half the empire is converted. At least this is what historians presume, which is almost unfathomable. And yeah, you can do a mathematical model, but I think that's just historically naive to do. I get what scholars are doing when they say, well, if you just do compounding interest, then of course you could convert the whole world, but it's not compounding interest, right? It's real social change. And of course, the lie to that kind of approach, which even people like Rodney Stark took in some ways, was that unlike the interest in your bank account, the money in your bank account that's invested somewhere, the rate of conversion or the growth of the church was not uniform it shrunk in some places and it grew much more rapidly in other places. And that's a lot more of an interesting historical story than the kind of, big picture I was mentioning. But Acts is kind of the paradigm, sort of this paradigmatic model. And it does show travel. I mean, the kind of typical statement is that Jesus says in Acts 1 verse 8, "You'll be my witnesses in Judea, in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and to the ends of the earth." And you do I don't think that's an organizing structure for Acts, as some people have argued it is. But you do kind of get that movement from Jerusalem, and then Paul ends up in Rome, and he has these missionary journeys throughout. He's going to Greece, so he's going to Europe, and he's going through what we would call Anatolia or modern day Turkey, and yes, it becomes sort of the paradigm for what you'd see as later Christian expansion.
You said there was another one you wanted to point out?
Yeah, I would say the Big Blue Book there, the Acts of the Apostles, I would say that's the best commentary on the Greek text, at least for now. We'll see what we can do. I mean, I'm working on one with Stanley Porter, but that should take a number of years to come out. But this is from a generation or two ago. That's the third edition. The second edition is actually, I would probably choose it over the third edition. Third edition kind of went backwards a little bit in some ways, but F.F. Bruce was just, sort of an inimitable historian. He was a classicist who kind of moved into New Testament, and a great historian, brilliant scholar, and kind of the model of concision, where he's doing historical and Greek language comments on here, but he's brief, he's to the point, he expands when he needs to expand, but he doesn't belabor anything, and just a model book. So if there's a student who's like, I want to get the newest, flashiest thing, again, until our commentary comes out, then they can, of course, buy it. But F.F. Bruce is kind of, I would say, second to none there. I mean, I could talk about all of these. I probably just don't have the wind power to do it. A couple friends wrote those books there, Peters and Armstrong, on the two books there, Luke, and then Dating Acts. So those are friends, and those are both great monographs on Luke and Acts. Just kind of putting it in historical context. Really, really good stuff. Porter's commentary on Romans is great. Published with Sheffield Phoenix, probably a little bit overlooked because of Sheffield Phoenix. The publisher is not as really well known or popular. It's well known, I should say, but it doesn't get the kind of attention that the other publishers do. But that's a great little commentary. I say little, it's a lot of work behind it, but it's actually not huge. You can see the other Romans commentaries beside it are massive, and for one reason or another, they're massive. But this is a great commentary, and the work is so sort of, the iceberg image where you don't see the iceberg underneath the line of the water. That's kind of what that commentary is like. And so you get all the payoff, but you don't actually have to slog through the Greek text. He's got another companion volume of the Greek text, and I recommend that Romans commentary by Porter to people who want actually really astute judgments on the big issues. Really, really good stuff. But these other Romans commentaries are great too. They're more standard, standard big boy commentaries that talk about everything. I don't say big boys like you need to be a big boy to read them. I mean, they're the fat commentaries. Kind of moving through some of Paul's letters here. Some of these were seminary texts. That book by Silva is very good. It's a unique kind of book there, interpreting Galatians. There's De Silva and then there's Silva, two different authors. The tan, taller one there is the one I was mentioning. And it's really good. Not a commentary, it's not a monograph, it's kind of a series of interpretive essays on issues like, how do you do historical reconstruction? How do you do discourse analysis? How do you understand language issues? And we used that in seminary, and it was great. That's a great book. Yeah, some other commentaries there on Galatians. All right, now we're getting into Greek. So start with grammars, and Blast, Brunner, and Funk this is kind of the standard reference grammar in what you would call like biblical, like New Testament Koine. It's very good, and of course it has issues. It's dated by this point. So what happened was there's an older the Brunner and Blas they produced a reference grammar for the New Testament out of work that was done prior to in classical Greek, and then Funk came along and translated and did do additions. He did make it a better work, and it's still a standard reference. So I think some people overlook it because it's older, but I still turn to BDF. It's really good. Same with some of those older reference grammars. But that's Blasterbrunner and Funk. I have here on the left side of the shelf, a number of other grammars. So on the top there, the red one is Smith. Some people pronounce it Smythe, but I'm pretty sure that pronunciation is still Smith. And Smith or Smythe is the kind of, so he had a grammar for school boys, and then he had a college grammar. This was the college grammar. It's supposed to be a learning grammar, but it's kind of become a reference grammar for a lot of people because he's so comprehensive and so easy to read. And yes, it's dated. So this was kind of an edited version from the 50s, but his goes way back, like decades before that. But I still use Smith or Smythe, and that's a grammar of classical Greek. He does comment on Homer a decent amount. Sometimes he mentions the later Greek, which you assume is Hellenistic or Koine Greek. But so basically you have classical Greek, what's often considered sometimes Attic. It's more circumscribed to the kind of like 5th century Athens, 5th, 6th century, but you can think of Homer being in the Archaic Age, then you have this classical period, then with Alexander in the 4th, like late 4th century, you have the Hellenistic Age going into the Roman era. Classical Greek is sort of pre-Hellenistic. It's before Alexander. You think of the people Aristotle would have read. You think of Plato. You think of the great historians, Herodotus, Thucydides. You think of other writers from the classical age. That's a classical grammar. And then as you move into the Hellenistic and Roman period, you get, there's not a ton of change. Like so Koine Greek becomes a kind of new dialect, very similar to Attic, sort of a transformation of Attic Greek, because that's the language that spread through the Mediterranean. But most grammars of that later Greek, sort of what they used to call post-classical or Hellenistic, actually just focus on the New Testament. And I do think what you need is a Hellenistic grammar. So some have tried to do a little bit of that. I have a couple books there, but you could probably still use one. Anyway, that's Smith. I could say something about each of these grammars. I could probably just rapid fire them without saying too much. The big gray one there is sort of like, it's a newer grammar that's very good, and it was also doing this, like, let's talk about the New Testament, but not treating it merely as merely self-contained. So he's trying to do kind of a broader, he's talking about what you call, he's doing a bit of diachronic study where he's looking at older Greek and he's kind of applying a broader kind of Greek framework to the New Testament, and he does a good job. I think he's got some also comments on what you call text grammar or discourse analysis, which I don't really agree with everything, but it's really important to have in a grammar. But that is itself trends.
Could you just define diachronic for synchronic?
Yeah, so diachronic just means through time. And that would be, you think of like you're tracing out how the language was used from before and then through until the present time of whatever the target you're looking at. Synchronic is at the time. And so think of it like a game of chess where you're saying, okay, if you play chess, I'm not a chess player. I mean, I know a little bit about chess, but if you look at a board at any given time, you don't need to know the moves that were made before. You know those chess puzzles where it's like solve this in 2 moves. You just need to look at the board, and you can kind of get a whole. That's all you need to know to make the moves. You don't need to know what the first move of the game was. And the synchronic approach is saying, look, if you have a series of texts from a particular era within a certain corpus, you can kind of circumscribe it. That's all you really need to analyze the language. And that's like modern linguistics is it's a major contribution of the field. No one's saying that doing the historical analysis is not important or even needful, but it's just a question of priority. And so that would be the difference there. The blue one is the new, it's six or so years old now, grammar of classical Greek. So that sort of replaces Smith or Smythe in many ways. Of course, the problem with new books is that they're hard to hold. They're big. They are like, if you look at Smith and you say, this is so easy to hold, it's basically a handbook. The pages are obviously beautiful, and the typesetting is so nice and tight and compact and easy to read. And then you get the new books, and yeah, they're easy to read, but the books are huge. Like they're so big to hold, and there's a lot of white space on the page. And I get some people really like that, but I tend to prefer a handbook that, has a solid page to it and is pretty tightly typeset. But the Cambridge Grammar is an excellent grammar of classical Greek, and it's new, and it's probably the gold standard for classical Greek. I mentioned Robert Funk before with that grammar BDF, Blastebrunner and Funk. So he's famous for starting the Jesus Seminar, but he was a Greek grammarian as well, and he a very interesting grammar here, and he calls it Hellenistic Greek. It's mostly New Testament, but he had ambitions, and he did include some early Christian literature as well. The interesting thing about his grammar is that it's sort of an early example of what you'd call a structuralist linguistic approach, where he does do the synchronic analysis. So he's not really concerned with classical norms. He doesn't see the classical Greek as being the standard which you need to define it against. But he does a lot of, I think, good work on the structure of sentences, what you call syntax. And he's kind of hard to get into. I got it because I thought, can I teach students with it? But I thought it's not going to fly for many students. Actually, it's too idiosyncratic. But if someone's really struggling with Greek syntax, Funk may help them out, because he does a really good job at showing you've got about a half dozen kind of major sentence structures. And if you can understand how the sentences are put together in a pretty limited number of ways, and realize how complexity is just slotting things in to a few key sentence structures, then I think he really shows, like, I'm not sure it's the best way to learn a language, but he really shows, like, there's something to this linguistic structuralist approach for people who are skeptical. I, of course, believe in the linguistic approach, but in terms of pedagogy, I'm not sure starting students are going to latch on to what Funk was doing in his way. But if someone's skeptical, like, hey, do modern linguists really have great insight in that the ancients didn't tell you? Well, Funk shows you pretty clearly. Yeah, I mean, you can actually kind of map out the structure of syntax in an objective way, and he does that in the book pretty well. Those are some older reference grammars of New Testament Greek. Very good. I still use them, and so the Wiener, the one on the left, is older. It's a German scholar translated, and then A.T. Robertson is an American scholar in the later generation, and they're different. They're both very good. I mean, for starting students, probably they're a bit much. And like, for example, Robertson still uses what you'd call the 8-case system. So he's not a part of what we would see as a more contemporary approach to the cases. He's kind of letting Latin grammar kind of dictate the trend there. But they're really good reference grammars. And then the shelf goes on to some. I should probably pick up the pace here. Let's zoom out a bit, and then I can kind of give you a kind of bigger picture here. So I got some intro grammars there, just after the ones I was mentioning. And then I have you asked me earlier about comprehensible input. Those two black books reading Greek, and then the kind of white and gold books beside them that say Athenadze or Athenasde. They are very good classical Greek programs that run on the basis of large amounts of comprehensible input Greek reading. The only, I think, program which I would say is better for students to get a reading ability in classical Greek would be the 2 volumes by Günther Zuntz that I had mentioned to you before. Now, let me say a few things about these because they're very interesting. Once upon a time, there were scholars who did write, and the problem with ancient Greek is that it tends to be a bit more difficult because we don't have, for example, than Latin, because we don't have a community. There's been no consistent community of speakers, right? Latin, you do have speakers, and it was a tradition to write in Latin. So you could say you can really learn Latin by immersion in some ways. There's many resources for Latin, and there is a system of Latin reading called Lingua Latina, which is very good for English speakers, or French, Italian, Spanish, whatever. With ancient Greek, it's not a living language, and some people treat it as a living language, like the Polis Institute book there I have. The problems, which have long been recognized by people like Günther Zuntz, but others as well, are that you end up spending a long time doing what I would see as adiaphora, what's like you're composing your own Greek in even like creating words in order to communicate. So they'll get in a classroom and say, stand up, sit down, el tejode, come here, pass me the like kalamos, like the pen or something, and like what is on the tablet. And I think for some people, if you're with the right teacher, that can really work, and probably have to go and live somewhere. But the real goal with ancient Greek is to learn to read actual texts that are there. And sometimes someone says, look, I studied ancient Greek for 5 years and I couldn't say, how do I go to the bathroom in ancient Greek? I'm ashamed of myself. And I think to myself, well, yes, if you studied Spanish for 5 years and you can't say how to go to the bathroom, there's a problem. But how many times are you coming across how do I go to the bathroom in Egyptian hieroglyphs or in Herodotus? Well, you might come across it, in some treatment, but that's not the measure of whether you know the ancient language. The measure is whether you can pick up ancient texts and read them with understanding. Yes, you should be able to read them out loud and hear them with understanding. You should do composition. I agree with that. But there was this sort of skepticism, which was saying, listen, we shouldn't be using our untutored Anglicisms to butcher the Greek, and you should kind of just do the hard work to learn it. And someone like Günther Zuntz, in his brilliance and in his dedication, came along and came up with a course, which I don't have here. I want to get it, but I don't have it, where he did comprehensible input reading, but he only used real texts. And the way around the problem of the difficulty is that he couldn't do an extended narrative. He had to do it topically, and he had to do short excerpts, like starting off with phrases, clauses, sentences, a few sentences. And what he gives you is interest, where you're actually getting, aphorisms from philosophers, great sayings from historians, verses from Jesus' teaching. But it's real Greek. And if you want to kind of someone who's arguing against the living language approach, just read his introductions to those volumes and some of his essays. They're very good. But after his time, I think scholars have put together a very good editions of composed Greek. So it's their own story they wrote, but it approximates classical Greek very well. These two systems, reading Greek and Athanasde, are second to none. The Italian Athanasde is even better. It's got much more, and it has more picture helps and less translation helps. But in these, you're basically getting a long story that starts from very simple and moves into unadapted real Greek texts. And it's their, maybe 30, 40,000 words long in total. And they have their own grammar and exercises. So that's what those represent. And they helped me a lot when I was moving from Koine into classical Greek as well. Okay, there's another grammar and dictionary there, very good by James Morwood. But then I have lexica or dictionaries. So really quickly here, Cambridge Greek Lexicon, pretty good. This is new. It came out a few years ago. It's a product of a lot of work. The problem with it, in my mind, is that they only go up to they do some New Testament, but they only do the Gospels and Acts. So for someone who's interested in New Testament, it's not the best student's dictionary, even though it's meant for students. It's probably really good in general for Hellenistic and for classical Greek. I like the way they put it together, and this was like $80 for beautiful hardcovers in their slipcase, and so that's very good. The one beside it's very well known, which is called BDAG, and this is so you had this again, like Blastebrunner and Thunk, an older German project, and you have eventually a translation, and then you have an edition. So Walter Bauer was kind of the older German scholar, and then you have these other editors, and BDAG is the kind of gold standard in New Testament, early Christian lexicography, and it's still really good. Yes, there are issues. On my Bible software, I use other dictionaries like Franco Montanari's Brill Dictionary of Ancient Greek, which is really, really good, and Loewe and Nida's kind of semantic domains dictionary, but those are good. Woodhouse beside it is a kind of prized possession that I have there because it's not there's about 2 or 3 of them, but it's probably the best English to Greek dictionary. So if you're working on Greek composition, aside from Morwood's little dictionary there, which is good, Woodhouse is great, and it's just a beautiful physical book there. Yeah, then I have a number of Greek readers on the side of the shelf. So you've got little Thucydides reader, and I've read some of that. The World of Heroes, so the reading Greek, that's kind of like what you do afterwards. So I haven't read those 2 volumes. The Mythologica beside it, and the Alexandros, I've read both of those. Those are kind of basic Greek readers that were fun when I was getting into classical. I have Harry Potter and Winnie the Pooh, or Winnie Hofu, and it's those are kind of like these guys who are brilliant in Greek composition go and they basically translate these modern stories into ancient Greek, and they're pretty good. And I've read bits of the Harry Potter. I'm not quite there yet. I mean, I'm not into Harry Potter enough. I think if I went and read the Philosopher's Stone, then maybe I would have more interest, but I always thought that's a cool thing to have. Of course, I'm less motivated. They're not real ancient texts. And I've got some Hellenistic and Koine Greek readers, which are great. Yeah, starting on the top left there. So here's more. These are kind of more monographs or other grammars. Yeah, just a few here. There's the light blue book, was kind of my first intro to intermediate Greek. Porter, before I met him, I studied that, and then I met him years later, and kind of the rest is history there. But that's an excellent intermediate Greek grammar, probably second to none, I would say still. Minimalist, so it's not like weighing you down with so much content. Yeah, a few books by Porter. Some of these are just books of essays on linguistics and Greek. I've got some kind of more textbooky things on linguistics and biblical interpretation. Yeah, James Barr over there, the white and gold book. That's a very important book in the field. Yeah, some other books here on Greek. I won't say too much. I would want to, but everyone's gonna fall asleep and I'm gonna run out of my time. So yeah, some more books on Greek there. And then I'm kind of moving into, like, most of this is Greek. If not Greek, it's kind of getting into papyrology now, inscriptions, history. And so I've got kind of, you have the text of the earliest Greek manuscripts. So that's, I think, about 150 early papyri. Let's see here. Yeah. To P139 by Philip Comfort. Then I have some works on, textual criticism, the history of the canon, things like that.
You got some logs here.
My only lobes are the Iliad, of course. I see your videos and I'm thinking, I could use 100 more of those, but they're a lot of money. And I use a lot of lobes in my research, but I just use the online Loeb Classical Library through my university. And so I end up reading them a lot online and I don't buy them. But I love Loeb volumes. I think I typically find because you do have like Oxford Critical Text or something where you have
Classical
text.
OCT.
Yeah, the OCT. So you have just the text, but I find the Loebs, because of the LCL with the online database, they're typically the easiest way for me to access the Greek text of many different volumes. So I'm often on the LCL. Apostolic Fathers in Greek and English. That's like a Loeb volume. It kind of mimics a Loeb volume. I think Bart Ehrman might have a Loeb volume in the Apostolic Fathers, but that's Michael Holmes. That's really good. And there's the lexicon there. And this is the bottom shelf here. So this is kind of random commentaries, seminary books I had. So nothing major I would point out here. That book by Stephen Dempster, who is a professor of mine, that kind of gray book there, Dominion and Dynasty. That's a very good book. Those two books, Boda and Dempster, they're both professors of mine. And for people who are, like, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, but if you want a good basic, like the meaning and message of the Old Testament and its structure, and you don't want to read a 500-page book, those books are very well written, easy to read, educated, and engaging. So I would definitely recommend picking those up. Yeah, some commentaries there. I wouldn't say much more about those. Of course I could, but they're either self-explanatory or will take up too much of my time. But I probably have about 20 minutes before they. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
The Heresy of Orthodoxy.
Yeah, that book, The Heresy of Orthodoxy, is sort of it's kind of a response to some of the treatments of early Christianity by people who were deemed, too skeptical, like the notion that what you'd consider the proto-Orthodox consensus of early Christianity is somehow not to be trusted, because there were other books that didn't make it into the New Testament canon, and there were other Christianities that were deemed heretical, and so there have been major books in the history of the field on that. So those authors, like Kirstenberger and Kruger, kind of wrote as a way to combat that and say, listen, the kind of proto-Orthodox view is not actually, it's sort of become a heresy to people. Like, this can't be true. And they're kind of saying, no, there's good reason to think that the kind of canonical approach and the early Orthodox approach is a historically kind of redoubtable and venerable approach.
This 2-volume series right here reminds me of a book we talked about at the very beginning, I think, or maybe it was on your library cart, where it was like a history of all the different, it was maybe an encyclopedia or directory of all the different commentaries.
Okay, that's a little bit different. And I think there may be 3 or 4 of them now, but those are they're like they're really good. Those are like what they are. They're series of essays on major interpreters, and so um, I think those 2 volumes they dated them. They dated them. The first one was like prevailing methods before 1980, and so you would just have different scholars or different methods. And, someone's got like a social scientific approach. Someone takes, say, like historical critical approach. And the essay is trying to outline what was their approach, what was their kind of method, their framework, and then how they apply it to text. So that's really helpful for students, I'd say, in biblical studies who are saying, hey, like what have scholars done and how did they actually apply it to texts?
So I realized we didn't, when we were talking about German, when I asked you about comprehensible input, and then when we talked about it here, you were talking about Greek. So I don't know if there was any German items you would point, resources you would point.
For sure. For German, I do have a book around here. So I used online. So I think the best sort of if you want to do the kind of grammar approach, we used April Wilson's book German Quickly, which is very good, and you do get a decent amount of reading in the book, probably typical for a grammar. But for people who are interested in humanities, scholarship, reading grammar, April Wilson's like really good. However, one second. If you want to pick up German in a comprehensible way, which is a superior way, my wife and I, really enjoyed a series of materials by Andre Klein, and he has a website. I think it's called Learn Out Loud. No, Learn Out Live. Yeah, Learn Out Live. German stories. And I have a book here. It's called Dino lernt Deutsch. And this is just like four stories. And he has, I think, a dozen of these stories. And then he moves on to a series of kind of murder mysteries. And I think there's even like a fantasy one as well. And the cool thing about that is it's all comprehensible input. So you don't need to know any German to start. I mean, maybe the rudiments of like you do a couple weeks and like the alphabet, the very basics, but you get right into a basic story. And all of these he has, you can get them print book, you can get them Kindle, you can get PDF, audiobooks of him reading, and he's got sound effects and everything. And then you can actually get these books that highlight the words as he's reading. And then there's questions for each story. And he highlights important vocab. And the point is that you can read them, reread them, listen to them, and just move on to the next story. And he's building them in a way that they're just building on the complexity as you go. And I found like you don't get the direct grammar work, and he, I think, recommends other resources for that. But if someone wanted to say, you take like an April Wilson, you take a few months and you go through the text and say, I'm going to learn the basics of grammar, basic reading, get a dictionary. And at the same time or after that, you start powering through these. That's kind of what I did at that time. And it was very helpful. I think if someone, like I didn't make it through all of these, let alone to the next levels. But if someone did that and they had someone they could speak with, because I have a couple people who know German that I can speak with, when I say I can speak, I'm not able to speak fluently with them, but I mean that I'm able to say, can you speak to me in some German basic, whatever, then that would be a big help.
So Klein, is that Klein?
Klein, yeah, Klein.
And could you spell the title of the book?
Yeah, so you could say Learn German with Stories, but this first series, oh, you know what? I think you would just want to search Learn German with Stories, because this has its own title. That's only 4 little mini stories of his 16 or something. But then the individual stories have their own titles. Okay. And then, so there's not one, like this will only give them like stories 1 to 4. So I would say Andre Klein, Learn German with Stories.
Okay.
And or learnoutlive.com.
Okay. And then we have the final bookcase here.
Yeah, and so this is the random overflow, more or less. So aside from some Bibles I have up there, my preferred Bible I already mentioned to you, but I have a few more up there. Some books on Genesis.
What
This
is your
probably-
preferred Bible again, just so people don't have to look it up?
Yeah, it's I like the Revised Standard Version. I think it's a great translation for its time. It's a modern translation. It's got a little bit of the charm of kind of the echoes of an older English, which I kind of like. And it's this Oxford annotated edition of the RSV. But I have some others up there, an NIV and an NKJV. And so I like the King James. I like the original text, of course, but yeah, so some books on Genesis, and those kind of first three are more like issues in terms of origins.
I've
which I
never
was
seen
interested in.
a historical Adam book before.
Yeah, that book's interesting. I think I read that in seminary, and that's like a four views book. So they have some basically people taking four positions on the historical Adam. So they debate each other in the book, and I love those kinds of books. And yeah, there's a few Genesis books in there from when I was in seminary. A couple other books there. Yeah, there's not a ton I would sort of write home about here. Random books I've had from when I was younger. There's the Standard Review Biblical Literature you get sent every year as a member of the SBL. I think I opted out of that at some point. I didn't want the physical book.
How do you read this? Like, what is it? Do you just flip around, or is there?
Yeah, so that those volumes, they print all the reviews they published that year. And so the Society of Biblical Literature also, they publish the Journal of Biblical Literature and then the Review of Biblical Literature. And the reviews you can access online, but that's, in 2022, they've got maybe 100 reviews in there. And so they publish them. So they're academic book reviews.
How about this Mirror at the Mask?
Yeah, well, those books I can mention. So Lydia McGrew is she's a very interesting scholar. By training, she's a scholar of English literature. I believe her PhD is in English literature. By profession, she's an academic philosopher, so she's published a lot of work in philosophy. And by interest, she's kind of forged into the field of New Testament. And so she's written 3 books now, I believe, and a number of articles in the field. And, she comes with a very good analytic mind, and she's a good reader of texts. And so what she's tried to do is kind of bring this sort of analytic approach and say, hey, what are biblical scholars doing that don't make sense to it from a real analytic perspective, and trying to kind of bring up the level of kind of common sense analytical argumentation. So she's trying to, she takes a conservative position. She's saying, look, a lot of scholars are making kind of indefensible statements. And she's not necessarily attacking at what I would say are critical scholars in there. She's sort of trying to kind of call scholars in her own kind of circle to account, saying, hey, like, we're on the same page here, maybe in this sort of Christian world. And the kind of you're evangelical or conservative, but you're kind of making philosophical blunders and things like that. So Testimonies to the Truth is like a kind of very simple book to read with some of her views. I was able to write one of the blurbs in the front for that. The Mirror or the Mask is kind of a bigger version. And then she has 2 other books. One of them was on what she calls undesigned coincidences. And then another one on the Gospel of John, which is a lot to learn for scholars who are willing to. The challenge with biblical scholars and historians has always been that you want to do biblical studies is like there's not like a discipline that's like, well, what does it mean to be a biblical scholar? Well, I have my New Testament skills. It's like, yeah, but you need to learn ancient Greek. So you should learn ancient Greek. So you need help from Greek grammarians. You need help from linguists. You need help from historians, and you need help from philosophers. And sometimes biblical scholars have a hard time with the kind of negotiation of saying, I need to take other methods from other fields, but then I also need to stand my own ground and realize that other fields sometimes don't understand my field. But where, good faith, serious work is done, scholars from other fields can really contribute. Rodney Stark was someone who did that well. He's not a biblical scholar, not an ancient historian, didn't have Greek. He was a social scientist, and then he wrote a good book on the rise of early Christianity using his skills. And so that's a good example of what Lydia is trying to do. Some books on spirituality, Baptist history, and historical theology. Most of these are from seminary when I was doing my first degree in Toronto at Toronto Baptist Seminary. And anything that jumps out at me here in particular?
Got a number of works on Fuller.
Yeah, so one of my professors was Michael Haken, who is a Baptist historian, and he's a specialist in this man, Andrew Fuller, who was a Baptist minister. And Haken had a number of areas that he was good in, and I'm probably gonna, I think, it's an 18th century Baptist history or something like that, but his specialty, but he's really one of the, he's really the world expert on some of these eras of Baptist history, even though his academic training is actually in what you'd call patristics or the early church fathers. A great historian and a great man. And I consider him a close friend. Yeah. And then just some other books there. Of course, there are other books in the house. I've got some books on sports because I had a background in sports science, and some sports I do. And
what sports do you do?
I should say the only sport other than exercising, which I shouldn't say is a sport, but I have a lot of books on exercise science and things like that. When I was young, I did judo, which is a Japanese martial art of sort of grappling. It's an Olympic sport. People know what jiu-jitsu is. The kid came from judo, they're very similar. I got back into that a few years ago, took a couple of years off, back into it again. But I've got at least one physical, a number of digital, but one physical. It's a beautiful book, actually. And I don't have it on there, and it's upstairs, but the cover is sort of like the texture of a tatami mat. But it's a great book on, it's on what are called throwing techniques in judo. So I've got other books like that around the house. But the only thing, I guess, I had a couple here, aside from my online Greek New Testaments that I use, that I don't have on my shelves because I use them. But this was sitting somewhere in the house. I don't really use this reader's edition too much of the Deutsche Bibelgesellschaft New Testament, United Bible Societies. But this little handbook I tend to use pretty frequently, which is now, there's a 6th edition, but it's the 5th edition. I just like the little handbook. The apparatus of the NA, the Nestle Aland, is much larger. So I would prefer you can't really find a critical edition of the Greek New Testament that's small like this with no apparatus. The Tyndale House, which is published at Tyndale House in Cambridge, comes close because the apparatus is really small. So that's probably good to get. You can get a leather-bound Textus Receptus, which is like the underlined text of the King James version, which I'm less interested in. But I find it interesting that no one's making little, nice leather-bound critical edition of the New Testament without the apparatus. Just the text, just to read the text. And no one makes that, which is really, I think that would sell big time. But
Well, I had maybe a slightly similar idea, which is I actually asked the editorial director at Harvard University Press at the very end of that 3-hour tour, which is up on YouTube, would she consider doing a Greek Bible in the Loeb Classical Library? And she said she was open to it. So I talked to Jason about it. He's interested, and sounds like you might be interested. I think it would sell really well as well. So
now, That's intriguing to me. Maybe we should touch base offline about this because you're talking about doing the Greek text and the facing English translation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I could definitely get you in touch with people like Porter. I mean, or get them in touch with people like Porter or people who may be interested in that, at least if he knows people. They're big texts, so those would be big volumes, right? So you may have to break them up into multiple volumes, but
Loeb has done like, 10 volume series plus. So I don't think it would be too out of bounds. And I think especially starting with like a New Testament.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
I think it would be very popular. I've
It'd
always
probably be
thought
their bestseller. So
it could be huge. I've always thought it's a shame that they don't have the New Testament. And I think if they're going to do it, you need the right people doing it. So,
yeah, I mean, the Dumbarton Oaks has the Vulgate, and that was big. So, and that was the most popular from the giveaway that we did. Uh, I I had purchased that, and I decided, we gotta do something big for this tour. So I decided to give away my copy, and she signed it. So,
wow.
um, yeah, so I think doing that with the Lobes would be pretty cool. So we should definitely we'll touch base offline. So is there any final words you have before we wrap up this bookshelf tour?
Um, I've probably spoken too much. So, I mean, yeah, the only other thing is I would say if people are interested in New Testament and Greek, I do teach as well. And I will be teaching, full time in the coming couple years. But definitely if they're interested and I want to learn Greek or what should I read or I'm interested, they can reach out to me. I love to talk to people and help them out. And other than that, I think yeah, just thank you for doing this. And I love to talk about books. And I don't know if I've met anyone who loves books as much as you, because you have some serious, I mean, this is already long, but you have some serious videos on your channel. So more power to you, man.
Thank you.
And yeah, more power to all those bibliophiles who are hopefully, it's not about just getting books for their own sake, though I do believe in having a library. People think, have you read all these books? No, I've read many. I've not read probably more than I've read. And I've looked at all of them. I've used almost all of them. But the point is, you have things that are there to invite you into more. And I hope that people like what I like to do with your videos, because I can't sit and watch them all, but I like to look at the areas that are of interest to me and say, what do they have? Is there something I don't know? Because there's so many books we don't know about. And many times you come across truly great books because you see it on someone else's shelf. And so hopefully someone's picked something up and, maybe they could be inspired to go read and read a good book.